Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Cedar Ridge land office swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every clerk inside went still like rabbits that had just heard a hawk scream. Silas walked straight to the front counter, dropped a leather satchel that landed heavy as a stone, and looked at the young clerk behind the desk the way a man looks at something he's already decided to crush. "Ashcroft's deed," he said. "Pull it." The clerk's hands were shaking before he even reached the filing cabinet. Silas didn't wait. He reached across the counter, grabbed the file himself, and opened it right there. He ran one thick finger down the page, found what he was looking for, and smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant anything good. "There it is," he said quietly. "He's 3 months behind on the water assessment." He snapped the file shut and looked at the clerk like the man was furniture. "Start the forfeiture paperwork." "Mr. Crow, the assessment period doesn't close until—" "I said start the paperwork." Nobody in that office said another word. "What?" If you've never seen a story about a man who built a wall around his heart so high he forgot what the view looked like from the other side, stay with me, because this one's going to take you somewhere real. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single part of this story, and hit that like button if you're already feeling something. Drop a comment and tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go back to where it all began. The morning Gideon Ashcroft rode into Cedar Ridge to turn a woman around and send her home, the sky was the color of a bruise healing, purple at the edges, going pale in the middle, cold enough that his breath came out in short white clouds, and his horse, a big sorrel named Fletcher, kept tossing his head like he didn't want to be there either. Gideon didn't want to be there either. He'd been up since 4 in the morning, not because there was ranch work that couldn't wait. There was always ranch work that couldn't wait. But because the moment he'd read his sister Margaret's letter the night before, sleep had left him like a man walking out of a room without saying goodbye. He read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen table, holding the paper under the lamp, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less insane. "Gideon, I know you're going to be furious. I need you to be furious somewhere other than my house. I've arranged a mail-order bride for you. Her name is Isabella Whitmore. She's 26 years old and she arrives on the Thursday morning train from Chicago. Before you say anything, you haven't said anything in 4 years. Not really. The ranch isn't a life, Gideon. It's a hiding place. I love you too much to keep letting you hide. Margaret. He had folded the letter very carefully, set it on the table, and then stood there for about a full minute before he picked up his coffee cup and threw it against the wall. Fletcher got him to Cedar Ridge in just under 2 hours, which was faster than usual, because Gideon didn't give the horse much choice about pace. The town was waking up slowly, the feed store pushing its doors open, a woman shaking out a rug from an upstairs window, 2 old men on a bench in front of the barber shop who watched Gideon ride past with the practiced interest of people who had nothing better to do than notice things. He tied Fletcher to the post outside the station and went inside. The station master, Earl Briggs, was sweeping the platform and looked up when Gideon came through the door. Earl had known Gideon for 15 years. He took one look at the expression on his face and went back to sweeping without saying a word. "Smart man, Earl." Gideon sat on the bench nearest the door and took off his hat and turned it in his hands. He was trying to figure out exactly what he was going to say to this woman. He needed to be clear but not cruel. He needed to be firm without being a complete, he searched for the word, without being a complete bastard about it. He hadn't thought of a single useful sentence by the time the train whistle sounded in the distance. He stood up, pushed his hat back on, squared his shoulders. He was a big man, 6'2", with the kind of build that comes from 30 years of actual physical work, rather than anything intentional. His hands were calloused at every joint. His face had lines in it that had been put there by wind and sun, and 4 years of grief that had never been given anywhere proper to go. He was going to be polite. He was going to explain that there had been a misunderstanding. He was going to give this woman whatever money she needed for a return ticket, plus some extra for her trouble, and then he was going to ride back to his ranch and have a very long, very uncomfortable conversation with Margaret. That was the plan. The train came in with a great hiss of steam and a grinding of brakes, and Gideon stood on the platform with his arms crossed and his jaw set and waited. 3 men got off first, then a family, father, mother, 2 children, who immediately started running in opposite directions while their mother grabbed for them. Then an older woman in black who moved slowly and carefully down the steps with a carpet bag over one arm. Then Isabella Whitmore stepped off the train. She came down the steps like she was concentrating on each one individually, which made sense because the heel of her left boot caught the second-to-last step, and she grabbed the railing with both hands to catch herself. And for just a moment she was completely ungraceful, scrambling and clutching metal with her gloved hands. And somehow that was the first thing that Gideon registered. Not her face, not her hair, not the green of her eyes, but the fact that she almost fell and caught herself and then stood up straight immediately, like she had decided that almost falling didn't count if you recovered fast enough. Then he registered the rest. The honest word was beautiful, and Gideon was not a man who used that word loosely or often. She had dark chestnut hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had probably been nice about 1,000 miles ago and was now slightly crushed on one side. Her coat was clean but thin for Montana weather. She held a single suitcase in her right hand, small enough that he could tell from 20 feet away it wasn't very heavy, and she stood on the platform and looked around Cedar Ridge with the careful attention of someone who was trying very hard to look like they weren't terrified. She was doing a decent job of it, and then he saw it, just one single tear slipping down the right side of her face. She didn't make any move to wipe it away. She might not have known it was there. She was still scanning the platform with those green eyes, looking for him, he realized, looking for the man who was supposed to meet her. Gideon didn't move. He stood exactly where he was and felt something shift inside his chest in a way he didn't have a name for and didn't particularly want to examine. He had come here to send this woman back. That was still true. That was still the plan. Everything about the plan was still exactly the same as it had been when he rode into town. He made himself walk toward her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned and he saw her register him, the size of him probably, because people usually registered that first. And then she straightened her spine slightly and met his eyes with a directness that caught him off guard. "Yes," she said. "You must be Mr. Ashcroft." "I am. I'm very glad to meet you." Her voice was steady. Whatever that tear had been about, she'd put it somewhere else. "I apologize for my appearance. The journey was longer than I expected." "It's fine." He pulled his hat off, which felt like the thing to do. "Miss Whitmore, I need to speak with you directly about something." She waited. Not nervously, or at least not showing it. "My sister arranged this," he said, "without my knowledge, without my consent. I want you to understand that I'm not the kind of man who would have done this." He paused. "What I mean is, I didn't send for you." Something moved across her face, just briefly, there and gone. "I see," she said. "I think you should know that right away, so you have all the facts." He turned his hat in his hands again. He'd already told himself to stop doing that. "I'd like to purchase a return ticket for you and give you something for your trouble besides." "It's the least—" "How much is a return ticket to Chicago?" she asked. The question surprised him. I'd have to ask Earl, the station master, but I'll cover whatever it costs." "I don't mean to be difficult," Isabella said quietly. "I just want to understand the situation, because the ticket from Chicago to here was nearly everything I had, and She stopped, pressed her lips together for just a moment. "It doesn't matter. What does the next eastbound train cost, do you know?" "I don't know exactly, but it doesn't matter what it costs. It matters to me, Mr. Ashcroft." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The morning wind came through the platform and pulled a strand of hair loose from under her hat, and she didn't reach up to fix it. "How much do you have?" he asked. He knew it was blunt. He said it anyway. She didn't flinch. 17 cents. The number just sat there between them. 17 cents. "Right," Gideon said. He put his hat back on. He looked down the track where the train was still sitting, steam drifting up from the engine. He looked at the town, the feed store, the barber, the two old men on the bench who were now watching the platform with considerable interest. He looked at Isabella Whitmore standing in front of him with one small suitcase and a traveling hat crushed on one side and 17 cents to her name. "The next eastbound train leaves Friday morning," Earl Briggs said from somewhere behind Gideon, because Earl Briggs apparently had very good hearing and no particular interest in minding his own business. "Friday," Gideon repeated. "Yes, sir. 3 days." 3 days. Gideon did the arithmetic that needed doing in his head, which was, he couldn't put this woman in the street, he couldn't put her in the hotel with 17 cents, and he couldn't drive back to his ranch and leave her standing on the platform like luggage that nobody wanted. All right, he said. He didn't look at Isabella when he said it, which he realized was cowardly, so he made himself look at her. My ranch is about 2 hours north. You can stay there until Friday. I've got a spare room it's a spare room. Clean. The housekeeper comes Tuesdays, but she can make it up before we get there. He paused. I want to be clear that this isn't a change in my position. You'll stay 3 days, I'll put you on Friday's train, and we'll call it settled. Isabella Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read what she was thinking, which was unusual for him. He was generally good at reading people. That's very kind of you, she said finally. Thank you. It's not kindness, it's practical. He picked up her suitcase before she could protest. It was lighter than he expected, much lighter. Come on, my horse is out front. Acham. Fletcher did not love having 2 riders, and he made his feelings known about it for the first 20 minutes of the ride by being generally unpleasant, head-tossing, half-rearing when a prairie dog startled him, and once stopping completely in the middle of the road for no reason at all, except apparently he felt like stopping. He's not usually like this, Gideon said. He seems fine to me, Isabella said. She was sitting behind him, which had been an awkward arrangement to negotiate at the mounting block, and she was holding the back of the saddle rather than his waist, which he'd told her was going to be uncomfortable once they hit the open country, and she'd said she'd manage. He's sulking. Do horses sulk? Fletcher does. Gideon clucked at the horse, who moved forward with an air of great personal suffering. He's sensitive. That's an unusual quality in a ranch horse. He's an unusual horse. They rode in silence for a while after that. The country opened up around them, the wide flat stretches of the valley bottom giving way to rolling grassland, the mountains to the west still holding snow on their upper faces even this late in the spring. It's bigger than I expected, Isabella said. What is? All of it. The sky. The land. She paused. In Chicago, everything is close. The buildings, the streets. You can never see very far in any direction. Does it bother you, the openness? No. She said it simply, like she'd already considered the question and had a firm answer. I think I like it. Gideon didn't reply to that because he didn't know what to say to it and didn't want to say the wrong thing. They were about 40 minutes from the ranch when he heard it. Hoofbeats coming up behind them, fast, 2 horses at least, coming hard. He looked back over his shoulder. 2 riders. Coming at a pace that wasn't neighborly. He pulled Fletcher up and turned. The riders came in close enough that Fletcher threw his head and stamped, and Gideon put one hand on the reins to hold him steady. He recognized both men. The one in front was Dex Pruitt, who worked for Silas Crow and had the disposition of a man who'd been stepped on too many times and decided to start stepping on other people. The one behind was somebody Gideon didn't know. Younger, harder looking, with the kind of eyes that didn't land anywhere specific. Morning, Ashcroft, Pruitt said. He wasn't looking at Gideon. He was looking at Isabella. Pruitt. Didn't know you were expecting company. His eyes moved over Isabella with the slow, deliberate rudeness of a man who wanted you to notice he was doing it. This your mail order, girl? Gideon's jaw tightened. What do you want, Dex? Mr. Crow wanted me to pass along his regards. Pruitt finally looked at Gideon. And to say he's still interested in buying your north pasture, water rights included. Says his offer's going up at the end of the month. His offer's been declined. Tell him that. I'll tell him. Pruitt looked at Isabella again. Also wanted to welcome the lady to Montana Territory. He tipped his hat with a smile that wasn't a smile. Hope she finds it agreeable. We're done, Gideon said. Move off. Pruitt held the look for 2 seconds longer than he needed to, then turned his horse and both men rode back the way they'd come. Gideon watched them until they were well off. Who is that? Isabella asked quietly. Nobody worth knowing. He turned Fletcher back north and clicked him forward. He works for a man named Crow. Silas Crow. Owns a big spread east of mine. Bigger every year. How does it keep getting bigger? Gideon was quiet for a moment. That's a very good question, he said. The ranch was, honestly, it was a mess. Not filthy, exactly, but the kind of mess that settles into a place when nobody loves it anymore. The curtains in the front windows had a tear in one of them that had been torn for at least 2 years. The porch rail had a loose board Gideon kept meaning to fix. The kitchen garden was mostly weeds. The main house was structurally sound and had good bones, as they said, but it had the particular emptiness of a place that used to have a life in it and didn't anymore. Gideon watched Isabella take it in as he helped her down from Fletcher and handed the horse off to his ranch hand, a quiet older man named Burl, who materialized from the barn without being called. "It's not," Gideon started. "It has good bones," Isabella said. He stared at her. "I was just thinking that. The porch rail just needs a nail. The curtain can be fixed tonight if I have thread." She was already looking at the garden. "What's planted in there?" "I honestly couldn't tell you." She nodded slowly, like he'd confirmed a theory. Then she picked up her own suitcase before he could get to it and walked up the porch steps. He had a cook, a man named Hector, who came in 3 days a week. But this was not one of Hector's days, so the kitchen was empty and cold. Gideon built up the stove while Isabella stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything, cataloging it. "I'll fix the curtain first," she said, "if you have thread. Margaret left a sewing kit somewhere. She comes by enough, she keeps things here." "Margaret is your sister? The one who arranged this?" "Yes." "She sounds like she loves you very much." Gideon looked up from the stove. "She's interfering and she had no right." "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, Mr. Ashcroft." He didn't have an answer for that, which happened twice in one day with this woman, which was unusual. She found the sewing kit in the third drawer she tried. She found a needle and thread that nearly matched the curtains. She had the tear fixed in about 12 minutes, cleanly too, he checked later, with small even stitches. And by that time the kitchen was warm and she was already going through the cabinets to see what was available for a meal. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know I don't have to." She pulled out dried beans and set them aside. "Do you have any smoked meat?" "Root cellar. I'll get it." He brought the smoked pork up from the root cellar and handed it to her, and she took it without fuss and started doing things with it that he couldn't quite follow, but that eventually produced a smell in the kitchen, so good it made him realize he hadn't eaten properly since the day before. His 3 hands, Burl, and 2 younger men named Cord and Wade, drifted in from the barn around supper time, drawn by the smell, and stopped dead when they saw a woman at the stove. Cord, who was 22 and had no filters of any kind, said, "Who's that?" "Her name is Miss Whitmore," Gideon said. "She's a guest. She's staying until Friday." "She smells better than Hector," Cord said. "She can hear you," Isabella said pleasantly, without turning around. Cord went red to the ears. Wade, who was older and had better instincts, elbowed him in the ribs. Burl just sat down and took off his hat and waited for supper, which was the correct response. They ate around the big kitchen table, all 5 of them, which hadn't happened since Margaret was last here. And the food was remarkable. Not fancy, just good. The way food was good when someone who knew what they were doing made it from whatever was on hand. Cord had 2 portions and would have had 3. Except Burl caught his eye across the table and shook his head slightly. After, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Gideon sat at the table with his coffee and watched Isabella wash the dishes. "You're good at that," he said. "The cooking, where did you learn?" She glanced back at him. "My mother was ill for 3 years before she died. Then my father for 2 years after her. I learned to cook early because somebody had to." She went back to the dishes. "I'm also good at stretching a small budget further than it looks like it should go, and at keeping accounts, and at talking to creditors." A pause. "I had a lot of practice with creditors." "That's a hard thing, losing both of them." "It was." She said it quietly and without performance. "It took everything, the house mostly. There wasn't much left by the end." She set a clean pot on the counter. "I answered the advertisement because it was the most practical option I could find. I want you to know that. I'm not a romantic about it. I knew what it was." "Then why—" He stopped. "Why what?" "The tear. On the platform, when you got off the train." She was quiet for a moment. She dried her hands on the cloth hanging by the basin and turned around. "I was scared," she said. "I'm not usually scared like that, but I'd been on a train for 4 days and I had 17 cents, and I didn't know what you'd look like or what kind of man you'd be, and the platform was so cold, and I didn't know anyone for 1,000 miles. She met his eyes evenly. "That's all it was. I'm not someone who cries easily. I believe that, he said. He did believe it. He believed it absolutely, and he wasn't sure why. Mr. Ashcroft, she said, you can call me Gideon. She considered this. All right, Gideon, I want to say, I understand the situation. I understand that you didn't send for me and that you have no obligation to me beyond what you've already given. I won't make these 3 days awkward for you. She folded the drying cloth with precise movements. I'll do what I can to be useful while I'm here, and I won't ask for anything you haven't offered. You don't have to work for your lodging. I'm not working for my lodging. I'm just not able to sit still. She said it like it was a flaw she'd identified in herself. I've never been good at sitting still. He looked at her across the kitchen. The lamp was burning low and the stove was still warm, and somewhere outside one of the horses nickered quietly, and then the ranch was just quiet. There's a box of records in the study, he heard himself say. Cattle records, land records, water rights documentation. Margaret's been at me to organize it for 2 years and I can't make heads or tails of it. He paused. If you're looking for something to do, I'll look at it in the morning, she said. It's bad, he warned her. I've seen bad records before. She went to the room he'd shown her, the spare room at the back of the house, the one that still had some of Margaret's things in it. And Gideon sat alone at the kitchen table with his empty coffee cup and looked at the curtains across the room, the ones she'd fixed with 12 minutes of work and small, even stitches. He had come to town to send her away. That was still the plan. He was going to put her on Friday's train. He was absolutely going to put her on Friday's train. He got up and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around him, and tried to remember the last time the house had smelled like a real meal, and couldn't. The next morning, he came downstairs before dawn to find the kitchen already warm, the coffee already made, and Isabella already in the study. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, which surprised him somehow, the casualness of it, with papers spread in a wide arc around her and the ledger open across her knees. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear and another one in her hand, and she was frowning at something she was reading with the focused attention of someone doing surgery. She heard him in the doorway and looked up. Your water rights documentation stops in 1879, she said. There's a gap of 3 years. I know there's a gap. I've been meaning to. In that 3-year gap, your neighbor filed 2 documents with the land office. She held up 2 papers. I found these at the bottom of the box. They're assessments, but the dates on them are wrong. Or, not wrong exactly, but the timeline doesn't make sense if you read them against the original grant. She paused. Do you know a man named Crow? Silas Crow? Something cold moved through Gideon's chest. He's my eastern neighbor. His name is on both of these documents. She held his gaze. Gideon, I don't want to alarm you, and I might be misreading this. I'm not a lawyer, but I think someone has been very carefully setting up a claim against the water rights on your north pasture, and I think they've been doing it for at least 3 years without you knowing. The cold feeling spread. Let me see those, he said. He crossed the room and took the papers from her and read them, slowly, standing there in the study in the gray pre-dawn light. She was right. He wasn't a lawyer either, but he could read, and what he read made the back of his neck go tight. I need to get into town, he said. Before you do, she reached into the spread of papers and pulled out 3 more. These. He took them, read them. He's been working this for 3 years, Gideon said. At least. She was watching him carefully. I could be wrong. You're not wrong. He handed the papers back to her and stood there for a moment, his jaw working. How did you find these this fast? I've had that box for... I sort things differently than most people, she said. Chronologically first, then by party named. She set the papers down carefully. I didn't mean to pry. You said it was a mess and I was looking for the pattern. You didn't pry. You... He stopped. You may have just saved my water rights. She didn't smile at that exactly, but something shifted in her expression. A quiet satisfaction, quickly contained. There's coffee, she said. You should drink some before you ride to town. It's cold this morning. He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had arrived on a platform 24 hours ago with 17 cents and a crushed hat and 1 silent tear, who had fixed his curtains and cooked his hands a meal and found in one night what 3 years had buried. Who are you? He said, and he didn't entirely mean it as a question. She looked up at him steadily. I'm nobody yet, she said. but I'm working on it. He didn't make it to town. He'd saddled Fletcher and had his foot in the stirrup when Burl came jogging out of the pasture with his hat in his hand and his face the color of old ash. North fence, Burl said, breathing hard. Cut. All of it. 3 of the young steers are out. Gideon put his foot back on the ground. He spent the next 6 hours with Burl and Cord restringing wire in a cold wind that picked up somewhere around 9 in the morning and didn't let up. Wade went after the loose steers and eventually got them back, though one of them had to be roped twice because it had found a direction it liked and wasn't interested in changing it. Gideon looked at the cut fence while they were working on it. It wasn't old wire failure. Someone had used cutters on it. Clean cuts, evenly spaced, done by someone who knew what they were doing. When? He asked Burl. Sometime in the night. I didn't hear anything. Burl looked at the cuts too. Neither did the dogs, which is strange. Or someone made sure the dogs had something better to think about, Gideon said. He looked east toward Crow's Land, though there was nothing to see. When he came back to the house at midday, covered in wire scratches and cold through to the bone, Isabella had lunch ready, bread and soup from the leftover pork, and had also somehow found his filing cabinet key, which had been missing for 6 months, and had it sitting on the kitchen table next to a small note that said behind the loose board under the kitchen window. She didn't make anything of it, just served the soup. He sat down and ate, and she sat across from him with her own bowl, and they were quiet for a while, and the quiet wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised him. Someone cut the fence last night, he said eventually. She looked up from her soup. How much wire? A 60-foot section. Cattle out? 3. Got them back. She was quiet. Is that the kind of thing that happens here? Fence cutting? It happens. He wrapped both hands around the bowl to warm them. Not to me. Not usually. But you have a guess who did it. He looked at her across the table. What makes you think I have a guess? Because when you came in, you looked angry, not worried. Worried is when you don't know. Angry is when you do. He looked at her for a long moment. Crow, he said, because of the water rights. Because of the water rights. She nodded slowly, turning her spoon in her soup. Are there other ranchers in a similar situation? With the water, I mean? Or is it just you? He hadn't thought about it that way. He turned it over. The Harlow place. They sold last year, but come to think of it, there were problems before they sold. Fence problems. A barn fire. What about the Kellerman Ranch, north of you? He stared at her. You've been here one day. How do you know about the Kellerman Ranch? Cord was talking about it to Wade while they were getting water this morning. He said something about them thinking about selling. She met his eyes. Cord talks a lot. Cord talks a lot, Gideon agreed. If the pattern is what I think it is, she set down her spoon. Gideon, this is bigger than one fence cut. If Crow has been systematically targeting properties along the water line and using legal documentation gaps to build a claim, she stopped herself. You need a lawyer, not just the land office. Nearest lawyer is in Helena. Then you need to go to Helena. She said it plainly, like it was obvious, because to her it clearly was. Not eventually, soon, before he files anything else. He watched her across the table. She had soup on the edge of one sleeve that she hadn't noticed. There was a smudge of pencil on 2 fingers from this morning's work. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, not in any deliberate way, just because it was the middle of the day and she'd been working since before dawn. She was looking at him with that directness again, straight at him, not performing anything, not trying to charm him, just looking at him like the conversation they were having was the conversation that mattered, and she intended to have it all the way to the end. He had come to Cedar Ridge to send her home. He still thought that. He did still think that. He was also sitting in his own kitchen eating lunch for the first time in 3 years that hadn't felt like a chore. And outside there were 60 feet of clean-cut fence wire that someone had put there to start the process of taking everything he had. And the woman across the table from him had found the paper trail in one night that 3 years had buried. I'll send a telegram to Helena after lunch, he said. Good. She picked her spoon back up. And one to the land office in Billings. The regional office, not the local one. She paused. If Pruitt is going through the local office, going above them sends a different message. Pruitt is Crow's man. I know. You told me. She looked at him calmly. Which means someone in the local office may already be accommodating to him. It's worth going higher. Gideon set down his own spoon. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Isabella. Isabella." He stopped, started again. "How much do you actually know about land law?" She considered the question with that thoughtful pause he was already learning meant she was being precise rather than slow. "I know enough to read a document and understand what it's trying to do," she said. "And I know enough to know when a document is trying to do something it shouldn't. The rest—" She was quiet for a moment. "When my father was ill, the bank tried to move on the house twice. I had to learn fast what I could and couldn't fight." She looked at him steadily. "People tell you that you need a lawyer for everything. Sometimes you do. But sometimes you also just need to understand what you're looking at." Gideon looked at the woman across his kitchen table. "You have been doing this," he said slowly, "surviving things, for a long time." "Since I was 19. She said it without any particular drama, just a fact. "It's not a skill I would have chosen to develop. But here we are." Outside, the wind pushed hard against the house. The stove ticked. Somewhere out in the barn, Fletcher kicked at his stall twice, which he did sometimes just to remind everyone he existed. "I'm going to ride into town after lunch," Gideon said. "Send those telegrams." "All right. And when I get back—" He paused. "There are more papers in that filing cabinet. If you're—" "I'll look at them," she said. He nodded, picked up his spoon. They finished the soup in quiet. He didn't say what else he was thinking, which was this. 3 days was a very short time, and for the first time since he'd ridden into Cedar Ridge that morning, he was aware of it being short. He pushed that thought away. He was going to put her on Friday's train, but he rode into town that afternoon with a heaviness he hadn't expected, and when he sent the telegram to Helena, he found himself writing it with more urgency than he'd planned, because someone was trying to take what was his, and for the first time in 4 years he found himself with something very close to a reason, beyond just the land, beyond just the cattle, to fight back hard. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet. He rode home into the dark, into the smell of something cooking, into a house that had a light in the window for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember. He tied Fletcher and stood on the porch for a moment before going in. 3 days. He went inside. He came back from town to a lit window and the smell of something with onions in it, and he stood on the porch longer than he needed to before going inside. It wasn't that he didn't want to go in. That was the problem. He did want to go in, and wanting to felt like standing at the edge of something with no clear bottom. He went in anyway. Isabella was at the stove. She didn't turn when he came through the door, just said, "There's hot water if you want to wash before eating," and pointed at the basin with her elbow because her hands were occupied with a pan. He washed. He sat. She brought the food to the table and sat across from him, and they ate, and it was the second time in 2 days that eating in his own kitchen hadn't felt like a thing he was getting through so he could move on to something else. He told her about the telegrams. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than people thought. "How long before Helena responds?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow, if they move fast." "And the land office in Billings?" "Same. Maybe longer." She turned her fork in her hand, not eating, thinking, "That's close to Friday." She said it neutrally. He heard what was underneath it anyway, or thought he did, and decided not to examine that too closely. "It might be enough time," he said. "Might not." He drank his coffee. "Either way, I need documentation on my side before anything else happens. The telegrams were the right first step." "I found 3 more documents this afternoon," she said, "in the filing cabinet, bottom drawer behind the tax records." She got up, went to the study, and came back with a small stack of papers that she set beside his plate. "These ones are different. These aren't assessments. These look like survey records. But the surveyor's name is Hanford, and I've seen that name once before." "Where?" "On one of the documents I found this morning, as a witness signature." She sat back down. "Same man surveying Crow's eastern boundary and witnessing Crow's water rights claims. That's probably legal, technically, but it's cozy," Gideon said. "Very cozy." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying it proves anything, but if you're building a case for a lawyer, that pattern matters." He picked up the survey records and read them. She was right about the name. He set them down and looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived with a crushed hat and 17 cents and had, inside 2 days, done more useful work on his land situation than he had managed in 3 years of knowing something was wrong and not knowing exactly what. "Isabella," he said. She waited. What did you do back in Chicago before all of this? Before your parents got sick? What did you study? Or, I didn't study anything formally. She said it without apology. We didn't have money for that. I kept my father's books from the time I was 16. He had a small import business, textiles. Not very successful, but it kept us. When it started failing, I learned why it was failing. She shrugged, one shoulder. Numbers tell you things, if you know how to listen to them. Documents tell you things. You just have to be willing to read them all the way through instead of stopping when it gets complicated. Most people stop when it gets complicated. Most people have the option to stop, she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment. She looked back steadily, without any plea in it, without any performance of her own difficulty. Just the fact of it, stated and then set aside. Well, he said finally, lucky for me you don't stop. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but a close relative of one. She looked down at her plate. Don't give me too much credit yet, she said. I haven't actually done anything useful. I've found papers. Finding papers isn't the same as fixing the problem. No, but it's how you start. They cleared the table together. She washed, he dried, and it was the most domestic thing he'd done in 4 years, and he was very careful not to think about that while he was doing it. After, he sat by the fire in the front room, and she sat at the other end of the settee with the survey records in her lap, going through them again with her pencil. The house made its sounds around them. The wind, the settling of logs, the occasional distant complaint from Fletcher in the barn. Tell me about him, she said, not looking up from the papers. Crow. Not what he does. What kind of man he is. Gideon stared into the fire for a moment. Calculating, patient. He doesn't move fast. He moves the way a slow flood moves. By the time you notice it, it's already inside the walls. He turned his coffee cup in his hand. He presents himself as a legitimate businessman. Generous to the church, polite at town meetings, never raises his voice in public. Which makes it harder to name what he is. What is he? A man who believes the valley should belong to him, all of it. Gideon's jaw worked. He's been here 8 years. When he came, he had 1 section and 100 head of cattle. Now he's got 4 sections, and nobody's quite sure how. The Harlows sold because they felt they had no choice. The Beckers before them. There was a family named Pruitt, different spelling from his man Dex, who had a good water section north of town. They held on for a while. Then there were problems. Equipment damaged. One of their hands got beaten on the road one night. Isabella had gone still with the papers in her lap. The hand. Was anyone charged? Nobody saw anything. Nobody was ever charged with anything. He was quiet for a moment. The Pruitts were gone inside 3 months of that. And nobody connected it. People connected it. Nobody could prove it. He looked at her. That's how he works. Every piece by itself looks like bad luck, or ordinary frontier hardship, or a man making a legitimate business transaction. It's only when you stand back and look at all of it together that the shape of it becomes clear, she finished. Yes. She was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling one of the shutters on the east side, the one he'd been meaning to fix for a year now. She glanced toward the sound and then back at the papers. He's going to move faster now, she said. Once he knows you've been to the land office. Once he knows you've sent telegrams. I know. Which means these next few days matter more than usual. He looked at her. Are you trying to talk me into something? No. She met his gaze directly. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're dealing with. It's not my ranch. It's not my fight. She set the papers down carefully on the cushion beside her. But you've been alone with this for a long time, Gideon. And sometimes when you're alone with something for long enough, you stop being able to see the shape of it clearly. He held her gaze for a moment. You've known me for 2 days, he said. I know. She said it without embarrassment. But I've known men like you. Not you specifically, but the pattern of you. The ones who take everything internal and just push it down and keep working. She paused. My father was that way. Right up until he couldn't work anymore, and then everything he'd been pushing down. She stopped herself. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to put you in a category. You're not wrong about the category. He said it quietly, looking at the fire. I'm aware of it. She didn't say anything to that, which was the right response. They sat in the fire's quiet for a while. And at some point she went back to the papers, and he just sat there and let the warmth get into his hands, which were still stiff from the fence wire this morning, and the evening wound down around them like it had done it before. It hadn't done it before. Not like this. He went to bed later than usual and lay looking at the ceiling and thought about a lot of things he wasn't ready to put into clear sentences yet. The second day was when the town started. He'd half expected it. He had not expected it to come from the direction it came from. He rode into Cedar Ridge mid-morning for feed supplies, and he was at the counter of Abelson's general store when he heard it. Not directed at him, just two women talking at the fabric counter on the other side of the store, their voices low and carrying the particular tone of people who want to be heard but want plausible deniability about being heard. Said she arrived with practically nothing. One bag. Well, there are women who know how to arrive looking helpless. It's an art, I've heard. A pause. The sound of fabric being moved. Gideon Ashcroft's a wealthy man. The ranch is worth... It's the ranch she's after, I'd imagine. Not him specifically. I don't think she'd care which rancher answered the advertisement, so long as he had property. Gideon stood at the counter and looked at the list of supplies in his hand and kept his expression completely level. Harlan Abelson, behind the counter, kept his eyes down and wrote up the order with great concentration. "Tell me when you need this loaded," Harlan said quietly. 20 minutes, Gideon said. He walked out without looking at the women at the fabric counter. He knew who they were. Martha Bellows and Ida Crane, who between them had managed to circulate every piece of information that had passed through Cedar Ridge for the past 15 years. They weren't bad women exactly. They were bored women with a gift for narrative. But the narrative was Crow's. He was sure of it in the same way he was sure about the fence cuts. Not with proof, just with the pattern of it, the speed of it, the very specific shape of the story they were telling. It had too many convenient details. Nobody in town could have put those details together from scratch in 2 days unless someone had provided them. He stood outside the store and looked down Main Street and breathed through his nose and thought very specifically about what he was going to say to Isabella when he got back. Which turned into thinking about Isabella, which was something he'd been navigating around since yesterday evening. She was smart in a way that was inconvenient, was the word that came to mind, and he nearly laughed at himself for it. Not inconvenient for him to manage, but inconvenient for the story he was still technically telling himself about the situation, which was, she would be on Friday's train, and this was all temporary, and he was not a man who would be undone by 3 days. He was not going to be undone by 3 days. He went back to the store, loaded the supplies, and rode home. She was in the garden when he got back. Actually in it, not just looking at it. She'd found gloves somewhere, his old ones, way too big for her hands, and she was on her knees pulling weeds with her hair completely coming apart and a streak of dirt on her chin. And she looked up when he rode into the yard and said, "There are actual carrots under here. Did you know you had carrots?" "I planted those 2 years ago," he said, staring. "They're still coming back. They do that." She sat back on her heels. "Also, your mint has taken over the east bed entirely. That's going to be a project." He got down from Fletcher, handed him off to Burl, who materialized again with his usual quiet timing and stood looking at Isabella in his dead garden in his dead wife's gardening gloves. He'd forgotten those gloves existed. "There's something you should know," he said. She read something in his face and got up, pulling the gloves off. "What happened in town?" He told her, straight through, no softening of it. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't look surprised, which told him she'd already considered this possibility. She looked, he'd say annoyed actually, tight at the jaw and still in the eyes, which on her meant she was thinking hard and fast. "Crow," she said when he finished. "He's fast. He's worried." She turned the gloves over in her hands. Men like him don't move to rumor unless they feel their actual plan is threatened. He saw you send those telegrams or heard about them. This, she gestured vaguely in the direction of town. This is a distraction. He wants you discredited or isolated before the responses come back from Helena. He wants the Valley to think you're a schemer so that when he makes a move, any alliance I try to build looks tainted. Yes. She looked up at him. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about what my presence here would give him to work with. You didn't do anything that needs apologizing for. I know that, but I'm still sorry it's happened." She was very direct about it, no excess emotion, just a recognition of consequence. "What do you want to do?" He had thought about this on the ride back. Nothing. That's the answer. If I go to town and argue against it, I'm giving it legs. If I let it sit, it dies when nothing comes of it. He paused. Eventually, she nodded slowly. That's probably right. A beat. Does it bother you, what they're saying? What they're saying about me doesn't bother me. He held her gaze. What they're saying about you doesn't need to bother you either, she said quietly. I've had things said about me before. I'm still here. He looked at her for a moment, the streak of dirt on her chin, the oversized gloves in her hands, the complete absence of any self-pity in her voice. Come inside, he said. I need to show you something. He'd brought back from the post office a letter that had been waiting. Not the Helena response, it was too early for that, but a letter from old Russell Kellerman, the rancher north of him, who had heard Gideon had sent telegrams to Helena and wanted to talk. Russell Kellerman was 71 years old, had been in this valley longer than anyone, and did not send letters casually. Isabella read the letter twice. He's been having the same problems. Fence cuts, a water diversion on his South Creek. Someone dammed it upstream briefly, just enough to make him wonder. One of his hands was offered money by a stranger to report on Kellerman's comings and goings. And the hand reported this to Kellerman. The hand reported it because Russell pays fair and treats people right, and the stranger offered him $50, which Russell matched, and then some. Isabella set the letter down on the kitchen table. You should ride up to see him. I plan to go tomorrow. Good. She smoothed the letter flat on the table, a precise, unconscious gesture. Take the survey records with the Hanford name. See if it matches anything Russell has. I was going to. She looked up. Sorry, you'd already thought of that. I had. But you're right to say it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I want to ask you something. She waited. If you had a voice in this, in all of it, the strategy, what would you do? She was quiet for a moment, not performing the consideration, actually having it. I'd stop thinking of it as a defense, she said finally. Crow wants you defending. He wants every rancher in this valley alone in their own corner, protecting their own fence line, using all their energy on that. The moment you're all defending separately, he wins separately. She pressed one finger to the table. What defeats a man like that isn't any single person fighting back. It's everyone refusing to fight him separately. A cooperative, Gideon said slowly. Something like that. Shared water rights management. Shared legal standing. She paused. It would take trust. And trust takes time, and you don't have a lot of time right now. A pause. But you have Russell Kellerman. That's somewhere to start. Gideon looked at the letter, then at Isabella. You should come with me, he said. When I ride to Kellerman's tomorrow, you should be there. She looked genuinely surprised. It was the first time he'd seen her look surprised. That's your business, Gideon. Your neighbor. You found the documents. You understand the legal angle better than I do. He kept his voice level. And Russell Kellerman is a man who takes people seriously based on how they talk, not who they are. You'd be useful there. More useful than I'd be explaining documents I only half understand. She was still for a moment. All right, she said. I'll come. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't the ranch worries exactly. Those were real, but they'd been real for months and he'd slept through them before. It was something else. The unsettled quality of it, the way the house sounded different to him now with someone else breathing in it, the way his own rooms felt like they belonged to him more than they had in years, which made no sense and made perfect sense at the same time. He was up before 4 again and went downstairs and found, again, the kitchen already warm and coffee already made. Isabella was not in the study this time. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his old county map spread open in front of her, and she'd been drawing on the margins of it in pencil. Not on the map itself, but in the white space, marking distances and names in neat, small handwriting. You didn't sleep, he said. I slept some. She looked up. I was thinking about the water routes. I drew out what I could figure from the survey records against the county map. She turned the map so he could see it. Look at this. If Crow controls this section here, and this one, which the Harlows had, he's got both sides of the main branch of Clearwater Creek. Gideon looked at the map. He'd looked at this map 100 times and never seen what she was showing him now. He'd control access to every ranch north of the ridge. Every single one, including Kellerman, including you. She put her finger on a point marked in her precise handwriting. But not if there's a recorded cooperative water agreement between the existing ranchers before he finalizes any claim. A prior agreement supersedes a new filing. Is that? I'm not completely certain. That's why you need the lawyer and Helena to confirm. She looked at him. But I believe it's right. He studied the map. The lines she'd drawn were clean and careful. The handwriting in the margins was exact. There was a whole logical structure there that she'd built in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning while he lay in the dark not sleeping. Isabella, he said, don't say I shouldn't have stayed up. I wasn't going to. He sat down across from her. I was going to say thank you. She looked at him carefully, like she was checking whether he meant it simply or whether there was something more complicated underneath it. He meant it simply. You're welcome, she said, and looked back at the map. They rode to Kellerman's after an early breakfast, taking the North Trail, which added time but avoided the main road through Cedar Ridge. Gideon had thought carefully about going through town and decided against it for now. Let the gossip settle, give it nothing new to feed on. Isabella rode the spare horse, a steady mare named Ruth, that Burl had saddled without comment, and without any of the opinions that Cord would have offered at length. She rode easily, not like a show-off, just competently, like someone who'd learned young and kept it practical. You've ridden before, Gideon said, because it was apparent. My uncle had horses. When I was a girl. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. I haven't in years. You look like you do it all the time. Things stay in your hands, she said, like knitting or playing piano. Even after years, you pick it up again and your hands remember. Do you play piano? Not anymore, said in a tone that closed the door on that particular subject clearly and without drama. He didn't push it. Russell Kellerman's ranch was smaller than Gideon's, tighter, the kind of operation that worked because every single piece of it was maintained precisely. Russell himself met them in the yard, a lean, weathered man with a white mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to watch before he decided. He looked at Gideon, and then at Isabella, and then back at Gideon with an expression that asked several questions without asking any of them out loud. Russell, Gideon said, this is Isabella Whitmore. She's been helping me go through documents. Russell Kellerman put his hat in his hand. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Kellerman. She reached into the saddlebag and produced the folded survey records. Thank you for writing to Gideon. I think you need to see what we found. There was a long beat. Russell looked at her, at the papers in her hand, at her face, at Gideon, and apparently made several rapid assessments that landed in the right place because he said, come inside then, both of you. They sat at Russell's kitchen table, which was a different table than Gideon's in every way but served the same function, and Isabella spread the documents out and walked Russell through what she'd found with the same clear, unhurried precision she'd used the first morning in the study. Russell listened without interrupting, which Gideon was already beginning to identify as the mark of a person who actually intended to understand something rather than just respond to it. When she finished, Russell was quiet for a moment, looking at the Hanford name on the survey record. His jaw worked. Hanford surveyed my eastern line in 1881, he said. I thought nothing of it. He came well recommended. Do you have the survey record he gave you? Isabella asked. Russell got up and went to his own filing cabinet. Better organized than Gideon's, but with the particular age disorder of a man who'd been alone for a long time, and came back with a paper that he laid flat beside theirs. Isabella looked at both of them side by side. Something changed in her expression. The measurements are different, she said. What? Gideon leaned in. Here. She pointed at a figure on Russell's survey, then pointed at the same reference point on the one from Gideon's files. Same line, different figures by 40 yards. That's not a surveying error, that's a surveying choice. She sat back. If the county record uses Hanford's other version, whichever one benefits Crow, then the boundaries are what Crow says they are, Russell finished. He said it slowly, like a man understanding something that had been trying to surface for a long time. The three of them sat there for a moment in the particular quiet of understanding something bad clearly. I have a surveying record too, Russell said finally. My own. I did it myself when I first filed in 1875. Old-fashioned chain measure, everything documented. He looked up. You think that would hold against Hanford's record? If it's properly dated and filed, a prior independent survey should establish prior claim, Isabella said. But Mr. Kellerman, Russell, you need a lawyer to file that formally before Crow moves. The timing matters. Helena? Helena, Gideon said. I've already sent a telegram. We may be able to move a single filing into a joint filing if you're willing. Russell looked at him steadily. How many other ranches in this valley do you think are sitting on the same thing we're sitting on right now? Gideon and Isabella looked at each other. I think at least 4, Isabella said. Maybe more, but I'd need to see their records to know for certain. Then we should find out, Russell said. He stood up. He moved like a man who had just finished making a decision he'd been circling for a while and was relieved to have it settled. I've got a horse that needs 10 minutes to saddle. There are 3 ranches I can reach before dark. He looked at Isabella. Miss Whitmore, if you'd be willing to explain it the way you explained it to me, I think people would listen. She looked at Gideon. He shrugged very slightly. Your call. All right, she said. Let's go. It was what came next that changed things in a way none of them had planned for, because the storm that had been building in the northwest since midday decided somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, when they were halfway between the Kellerman place and the nearest neighbor, to stop building and start happening. It came in the way Montana storms came, without much warning and with considerable conviction. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the space of 20 minutes. The sky went from gray to the specific dark green that meant serious weather. And the first fat drops of rain hit just as Gideon looked up and saw the line cabin at the edge of the north pasture tree line about 200 yards ahead. Ride, he said. They rode. They made the cabin with the storm about 30 seconds behind them. Burl and Cord had ridden out with them. Gideon hadn't wanted Isabella on the open road with Crow's men potentially moving around, and the 4 of them got the horses tied under the lean-to on the south side of the cabin just as the sky opened completely. Inside, the cabin was cold and dusty and smelled of old wood smoke and disuse. There was a wood stove, a single bunk against one wall, 2 chairs and a table, and a box of old supplies in the corner. Gideon and Cord got the stove going while Burl saw to the horses, and Isabella found a lantern and the oil to fill it, and within 15 minutes the cabin was lit and warming, and the storm outside had graduated from serious to the kind that made you very glad to be inside. Burl and Cord settled near the stove with coffee from the old supplies, thin and terrible, but hot, and Isabella sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup and looked at the fire through the stove's open draft, and was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking. Gideon sat in the other chair. After a while, Burl and Cord both fell asleep. Burl immediately, with the veteran's ability to sleep anywhere, and Cord more gradually, fighting it in the way young men do, and then losing. The storm pressed against the walls, and the wood popped in the stove, and outside the horses shifted and blew. Can I ask you something? Isabella said, low enough not to wake the others. Go ahead. Your wife. She said it carefully, not looking at him. Margaret mentioned her in her letter, but only in passing. You don't have to. Her name was Clara, he said. He said it straight, because the only way to say it was straight, or not at all, and he'd gotten to a place over 4 years where he could do straight. She was the kind of woman who made everything around her make more sense. The house, the ranch, me. She had a way of seeing things that... He stopped. She died in the winter of '79. Our son was 18 months old. He died 3 days after her. Same fever. Isabella was quiet. I'm sorry, she said finally, and she didn't say it the way people usually said it, as a placeholder for not knowing what else to say. She said it like she meant the specific thing, the specific loss of those specific people. What was your son's name? Thomas. He hadn't said the name out loud in over a year. It still had a weight to it. He looked like Clara. The storm pushed hard against one side of the cabin and then eased back. The stove ticked. I lost my mother in the spring, she said, and my father 14 months later. They're different losses, parents and... She stopped. I know they're not the same. I'm not saying they're the same, but I know what it is to have a house change around you after. The way the air changes. The way silence gets a different quality than it had before. He looked at her. In the lamplight, her face was softer than it was in daylight, or maybe he was just seeing it differently. She still wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the stove. And she wasn't performing anything, wasn't offering him comfort strategically, was just saying a thing that was true. I kept working, he said. After. That's all I did for a long time, just kept working. I know. She turned her cup in her hands. I recognize the shape of it in you. I'm not saying it was wrong. It kept you here. Sometimes that's enough. Is it enough? She looked at him then, direct, steady, with that habit she had of seeing things clearly and not pretending otherwise. No, she said, but it buys you time until you're ready for something else to be enough. He held her gaze. He was a man who had shut himself down 4 years ago because the alternative had seemed impossible. He had told himself the ranch was enough, the work was enough, that solitude was a reasonable trade for never feeling that specific kind of pain again. He had told himself this with considerable conviction for 4 years and had mostly believed it and had ridden into Cedar Ridge 2 days ago absolutely certain. He was not certain anymore. He was not certain of very much at the moment, sitting in a line cabin with a storm against the walls and a woman across the table who looked at him like she could see the thing he'd walled off and wasn't frightened by it or particularly impressed by it either, just acknowledged it was there. I'm afraid, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. She didn't ask afraid of what. She already knew. I know, she said. It's not marriage specifically. It's not, he stopped. It's surviving, afterward. I know how it goes, and I know what it costs, and I don't know if I could. Nobody knows if they could, she said. That's not a question that has an honest answer beforehand. He was quiet. The train leaves Friday morning, she said. Not a threat, not a question. Just a fact, offered as a fact. I know when the train leaves. She looked back at the stove. Burl snored once, shifted, went quiet again. The storm outside had peaked and was beginning, slowly, to ease back. The lantern burned steady and threw its light across the table and across Isabella's hands holding the tin cup, and across the paper she still had folded in her coat pocket from the day's work. He didn't say anything else that night, neither did she. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and they both knew it, and the silence afterward wasn't the silence of unfinished things. It was the silence of something that had finally been put down in the open where it could be looked at honestly. Friday was 1 day away. He sat in his chair and looked at the stove and listened to the storm pull back, and for the first time in 4 years he was not certain that keeping everything walls up and locked down was the same thing as being safe. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet, but he sat with it, which was more than he'd done in a long time. The storm broke before dawn, leaving the ground soft and the air cold and clean, and by the time Gideon got the horses ready and woke Burl and Cord, the sky to the east was going pale at the edge, in the way that meant a clear day coming whether you were ready for it or not. Isabella was already awake. She'd been awake before him, which he was starting to understand was simply how she operated, as though sleep was something she did efficiently, rather than something she gave herself to. She had the old coffee going again, and had folded the blanket on the bunk with the neatness of someone who believed in leaving things better than she found them. Nobody talked much on the ride back. Cord fell asleep on his horse twice and caught himself both times with the reflexive jerk of the young and embarrassed. Burl rode steady and quiet as always. Isabella kept her eyes on the trail ahead, and Gideon kept his eyes mostly on the trail and occasionally, without meaning to, on her. They made the ranch by early morning. Gideon unsaddled Fletcher himself, which he always did regardless of who else was around. And when he came out of the barn, Isabella was standing on the porch with her arms crossed against the cold, looking north toward the Kellerman place and the mountains beyond it with an expression he couldn't quite read. You should sleep, he said. I will. She didn't move from the porch. What time does the train leave tomorrow? 7 in the morning. She nodded slowly, still looking north. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at her and didn't say what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was not something he had figured out how to say yet, and saying it wrong seemed worse than not saying it at all. Come inside, he said instead. It's cold. She came inside. But the telegram from Helena arrived that afternoon. Gideon was at the fence line on the south pasture when Cord rode out to find him, waving the paper like it was something urgent, which it was. Gideon read it standing in the field with the wire cutters still in his hand, read it twice, and then folded it and put it in his coat pocket and rode back to the house at a pace that made Cord push his horse hard to keep up. Isabella was in the study, where else? and she looked up when he came through the door and read his face before he said a word. Good or bad? She asked. Both. He handed her the telegram. She read it. He watched her read it, the way her eyes moved down the page, the way her jaw tightened at one point and then relaxed at another. She read it twice, same as him. The lawyer is coming, she said, day after tomorrow. Name's Aldous Fitch. He's apparently handled 3 water rights cases in the territory in the past 2 years. That's good. She turned the telegram over in her hand. But this part, she pointed at a line near the bottom. He'd already seen it. Crow filed something with the county recorder yesterday morning. Fitch is calling it a preemptive claim on the northern water access. He says it may not hold, but it establishes a baseline that makes everything harder. Yesterday morning, Isabella said, and there was something sharp in her voice. Before he could have known about the telegram. He knew I'd sent one. Pruitt saw me at the telegraph office. Gideon sat down heavily on the edge of the desk. He moved the moment he knew I was moving. He had this ready. He just needed a reason to file it. Isabella was quiet, turning the telegram in her hands. So the documents I found? She started. Still matter. Fitch said they matter. But right now, Crow has a filed claim, and we have an unfiled counter-argument. He looked at her. And you leave tomorrow morning. She set the telegram on the desk carefully. Yes. Isabella. She looked at him. He'd been trying to figure out how to say this since the line cabin, and he still hadn't found the right shape for it. And standing here with the telegram on the desk between them and Friday morning coming like weather he couldn't stop, he decided that the right shape for it probably wasn't something he was going to find by waiting. I didn't handle any of this correctly, he said. She waited. When you got off that train, I had already decided. I had the whole thing decided before I even saw you. And I know that what I offered you afterward was, I know it wasn't much. 3 days, a spare room, a ticket home. He stopped. What I should have said, and didn't, is that the front door banged open. Both of them went still. It was Cord, breathing hard, hat in his hand, and the look on his face was not the look of someone interrupting by accident. Boss, rider coming in from the East Road, fast, 2 men behind him. Gideon was on his feet before Cord finished the sentence. He went out through the front door with Isabella behind him, which he would have argued against if he'd had a second to think about it. The rider coming in from the East Road was moving at a hard gallop, and even from 200 yards Gideon could see the horse was lathered, and the man was riding desperate, not fast. The man pulled up in the yard and Gideon recognized him. It was a hand named Pete Alvarez who worked for the Dunmore Ranch, 7 miles east, one of the operations they'd intended to visit the day before the storm stopped them. Pete got down from the horse badly, almost fell, caught the stirrup leather to steady himself. Mr. Ashcroft. He was breathing like he'd been running himself, not just the horse. Crow's men are at the Dunmore place. 4 of them. They rode in an hour ago with papers, said Mr. Dunmore has till sundown to sign over the water access on the South Creek, or they'd have the sheriff enforce a lien. He pulled his hat off. Mr. Dunmore sent me to find you. He didn't know who else. Gideon looked at the 2 men who'd ridden in behind Pete. They were Dunmore hands, too, both of them, and both wearing the same expression of men who'd been pushed into a corner and weren't sure which direction to push back. Burl, Gideon said, without looking for him, because Burl was always somewhere useful. Already saddling, Burl said from the barn doorway. Get Cord, too. Gideon turned back to Pete. Is the lien legitimate? I don't know, sir. The paper looked official. Mr. Dunmore's lawyer is in Miles City, and there's no time to— What kind of lien? Isabella said. Pete looked at her. Ma'am? What does the paper say the lien is based on? What's the underlying debt claim? Pete blinked. He said it was an unpaid water assessment from 1882. Isabella looked at Gideon. He saw it in her face immediately. The same gap, he said. Same gap, same method. She turned to Pete. The 1882 assessment, did Mr. Dunmore ever receive notice of it? Was he billed? Did he pay anything against it? I don't know, ma'am. I don't think he knew it existed until today. Then it's manufactured, she said. She said it flat and certain, same as the survey discrepancies. He creates a paper obligation during a period when records were thin, then collects on it years later when the rancher has no way to prove it wasn't real. She looked at Gideon. If we can get to the Dunmore place with the documents, it's not enough to counter an official lien without a lawyer present, Gideon said. I know, but it might be enough to stall. She held his gaze. Give Dunmore a reason not to sign tonight. That's all we need, one night, and Fitch arrives day after tomorrow. Gideon stood in his yard with the lathered horse and the desperate hands and the telegram in his pocket and looked at Isabella Whitmore, who was supposed to be on a train at 7 in the morning and was instead standing in his yard mapping strategy like she'd been doing it her whole life. Get your coat, he said. She was already moving. They rode hard to the Dunmore place, 5 of them, Gideon, Isabella, Burl, Cord, and Pete, and made it in under an hour because Gideon knew the back trails and pushed the pace hard enough that everyone's horse was blowing by the time they came over the last rise. The Dunmore yard had the tense stillness of a standoff. Frank Dunmore, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and the particular look of someone who'd been bullied into a corner and didn't like it one bit, but also wasn't sure he had options, was standing on his porch with a paper in his hand. Facing him in the yard were 4 men. Dex Pruitt was one of them. The other 3 were strangers, not ranch hands, dressed too well for that, with the look of men hired for specific purposes. Pruitt saw Gideon ride in and something moved across his face. Not surprise. He'd been expecting this, or something like it. He just hadn't expected it to come this fast. Ashcroft, he said. This is Dunmore business. Frank, Gideon said, ignoring Pruitt. Don't sign anything. Frank Dunmore looked at him with the expression of a man who was extremely relieved and trying not to show it. Gideon, these men say I owe. I know what they say you owe. It's not real. Gideon got down from Fletcher and went to the porch. Frank, can I see the paper? Frank handed it over fast, like he'd been holding something hot. Gideon read it. Isabella came up beside him and read it over his arm, and he could hear her breathing change slightly when she got to the middle of the document. The assessment reference number, she said quietly. Do you see it? He looked. A string of numbers and letters in the middle of the form. What about it? I've seen that format before. The sequence. She said it in a low voice, just for him. It matches the format on the documents from your files. Not the county recorder's standard format, a different format, Crow's own internal numbering. She looked up at him. He's using his own documentation and presenting it as official county record. Can you prove that? Not without the original side-by-side. But a lawyer can subpoena the county recorder and compare the numbering sequence against actual filed documents. If his records don't appear in the county's actual filing ledger, then there is no lien, Gideon said. Then there is no lien. He looked up at Pruitt. This document isn't a county record, he said. The reference number doesn't match county filing format. Pruitt's face didn't change. You're not a lawyer, Ashcroft. No, but I've got one coming from Helena day after tomorrow. And when he gets here, the first thing he's going to do is pull the county recorder's actual ledger and check whether this assessment number exists in it. He held up the paper. Does it, Dex? A long pause. One of the 3 strangers shifted his weight, just slightly, but Gideon saw it. Mr. Dunmore has until sundown, Pruitt said. Mr. Dunmore isn't signing anything, Isabella said. Pruitt looked at her. It was a different look than the one he'd given her on the road 3 days ago. There was something colder in it now, something that had been informed, briefed, prepared. This doesn't concern you, miss. You're not a party to anything here. She's with me, Gideon said. I'm aware of who she's with. Pruitt held her gaze for a moment longer than was polite or innocent. Mr. Crow sends his regards, Miss Whitmore. He says he hopes your stay in Montana has been educational. The specificity of it, Crow knowing her name, using it, was designed to land a certain way. It landed. Gideon felt Isabella go still beside him, not with fear, with the particular stillness of someone cataloging a threat. Tell Mr. Crow, she said, that the education has been excellent. Pruitt looked at her for one more beat, then turned his horse. Sundown, Dunmore? We'll be back. The 4 men rode out. The yard was quiet. Frank Dunmore sat down on his porch steps like his legs had decided they'd been working hard enough. Lord above, he said, and then caught himself, and then didn't seem to care. What just happened? You bought yourself 2 days, Gideon said. He turned to Isabella. The reference number. You're sure? As sure as I can be without the direct comparison. But yes, that formatting is consistent across every document Crow generated, and it's different from the county standard. She looked at Frank. Mr. Dunmore, do you have your own water records from when you originally filed? Frank blinked. Somewhere. Margaret, my wife, she kept everything. It's in the house. Would you let me look at them? He stared at her for a moment. Who are you exactly? Someone who's been looking at a lot of documents for the past 2 days, she said. That's all. Frank looked at Gideon, who gave him a slight nod that meant trust her. Frank looked at Isabella for another moment and then pushed himself up from the step. Come on inside then. While Isabella was in the Dunmore house going through records with Frank's wife Margaret, the two Margarets in one afternoon, which struck Gideon as coincidental and almost amusing in a day that had very little amusement in it, Gideon stood in the yard with Burl and thought. She's not getting on that train tomorrow, Burl said. Gideon looked at him. What? Just an observation. Burl had a way of saying things that he'd clearly been sitting on for a while, in the fewest possible words, with the neutral face of a man who considered it his job to state facts rather than opinions. I've worked for you for 11 years. I know how long you've worked for me, Burl. In 11 years, I've never seen you let someone else sit in the study. A pause. Just saying, it's not... Gideon stopped. Burl said nothing, because he'd said what he meant to say and didn't feel the need to elaborate. Isabella came out of the Dunmore house 40 minutes later with a folder of papers under her arm and a look on her face that meant she'd found something. Frank's original water filing, she said, 1876. Properly dated, properly signed, with the county recorder's seal. She held it up. His water right predates any assessment Crow could legitimately claim, by 6 years. She looked at Gideon. When Fitch gets here from Helena, this is the first document he needs to see. What about the others? Kellerman, the other ranches? If the pattern holds, and I think it does, every original filing in this valley predates Crow's arrival by years. He can't manufacture a prior claim against a prior claim. She was thinking out loud now, moving fast, the way she moved when the pieces were coming together. The cooperative isn't just a good idea strategically. It's a legal argument. If the ranchers file jointly, as a group with shared water rights established by collective prior claim, he can't attack them one by one, Gideon said. He can't attack them one by one, she confirmed. They looked at each other. You said day after tomorrow for the lawyer, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The train leaves at 7 tomorrow. I know. The next eastbound isn't until the following Friday. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. He held her gaze. I'm telling you that there's a lawyer coming in 2 days who is going to need someone who understands these documents to sit across the table from him and explain them in plain language. I can't do that. Kellerman can't do that. Frank Dunmore certainly can't do that. He stopped. I'm not asking you to stay for... I'm not asking you for more than... Gideon, she said. He stopped talking. I know what you're asking, she said quietly. And I know what you're not saying yet. She looked at him with those green eyes that missed very little. I'll stay. For the lawyer. We'll figure out the rest after. The rest moved fast, the way trouble moves once it decides to stop being patient. That evening, after they'd ridden back from Dunmore's, after a dinner that none of them ate much of, Gideon got a second rider, this one from the Kellerman place. Russell had ridden out to 2 of the neighboring ranches himself the day before the storm, and had found the same thing at both. Documents with that same off-format numbering, vague assessment claims from the early 1880s, and in one case, the Braxton place on the South Ridge, a signed agreement that Braxton's wife had found buried in a drawer and brought to Russell in a state of considerable agitation because she had never seen it before and could not account for her husband's signature on it. Gideon read the message twice. A forged signature, Isabella said when he showed her. That's what it looks like. She sat with that for a moment. Then it's not just manipulation of existing documentation. He's generating documents outright. If that's provable, it changes everything, she said. That's not a land dispute anymore. That's fraud, criminal fraud. She looked up at him. That's why he needs the whole valley. If even one rancher holds out and gets a lawyer who digs all the way down, the whole structure collapses. Gideon folded the message. He's one exposed thread away from everything unraveling. They sat with that for a while. He's going to move before Fitch gets here, Isabella said. Not with papers this time. Gideon looked at her. What makes you say that? Because papers didn't work on Dunmore today, and you've now directly confronted Pruitt twice. She was very calm about it, which made it more serious, not less. Men like Crow. When the legal approach is threatened, they don't give up on the legal approach. But they also have other tools, and they use them. Gideon thought about the Pruitt family, the hand beaten on the road. I'll double the watch tonight, he said. Burl can... It's not just your ranch, she said. It's Kellerman. It's Dunmore. They don't have four hands, Gideon. Russell is 71 years old and lives alone. He hadn't thought about Russell. He thought about it now and didn't like what he was thinking. All right, he said. He was already on his feet. I need to ride to Kellerman tonight. I'll go with you. No. He said it firmly enough that she stopped. Not tonight. I need you here with the documents. If anything happens to this house tonight while I'm gone... He stopped himself, recalibrated. These papers are evidence. If they disappear, we're back to nothing. You're the only one who knows where everything is and what it means. She held his gaze for a moment, assessing whether this was a real argument or a polite way of keeping her out of something dangerous. He held it back steadily because it was a real argument. All right, she said. Cord stays here. Burl comes with me. He picked up his coat. Don't open the door to anyone you don't know. Gideon. She waited until he looked at her. Be careful. He nodded. He went out. He was back before morning, and he had Russell Kellerman with him, the old man riding slow and solid on his steady brown gelding, carrying a saddlebag with his original 1875 filing papers and 3 other documents that Russell had pulled from a box he'd had since the beginning of things in this valley. Russell didn't say much on the ride over. I was a man who'd spent 50 years building something and was now looking at what it meant to defend it, and he was doing the math on what he had available to spend. When they came into the yard, Isabella was on the porch. She'd been awake all night. Gideon could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she stood with her arms crossed and her weight forward, watching the east road. Anything? He said. Nothing here, she said. Cord rode the perimeter twice. Nothing. He got down from Fletcher and looked at her and saw the exhaustion and the vigilance fighting each other in her face, and he felt something he didn't have a simple name for. Somewhere between gratitude and a kind of specific worry that was different from the general worry he'd been carrying for days. Come inside, he said. Both of you. They gathered in the kitchen, Gideon, Isabella, Russell, Burl, Cord, and spread the documents across the table. 4 separate ranches worth of original filings, assessment records, the forged signature document from the Braxton place, the Hanford survey discrepancies, and the reference number evidence from Dunmore's phony lien. Russell looked at it all, spreads across the table, and rubbed his face with both hands. Son of a gun, he said quietly but with conviction. He's been at this for years, Isabella said. She was standing at the end of the table looking at the spread of papers. Each piece by itself looks like bad luck or bad record-keeping. All of it together. All of it together is a plan, Russell said. And we're all in it. We're all in it, Gideon agreed. But now we know the shape of it. Cord was looking at the forged signature document. My brother-in-law knew the Braxtons, he said. Said they always thought the water troubles started from nowhere. Bill Braxton nearly sold over it. He paused. He didn't sell because his wife told him she'd never forgive him. Nobody laughed, but it would have been okay if they had. Tomorrow morning, Isabella said, I want to put together a single organized case file. Everything in sequence, dated, with a cover sheet explaining the pattern. She looked at Gideon. When Fitch arrives, I don't want him spending an hour understanding what we're looking at. I want him able to see it in 20 minutes. That's a lot of work, Russell said. Tonight's been a long night already. I know, she said. And that was all she said about that. Gideon looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. I'll help, Russell said, pulling out a chair. Tell me where to start. They worked through the morning. Russell organized by date because that was how his mind sorted things. Isabella organized by party. Crow's name, Hanford's name, Pruitt's name, building a web of connections across documents. Gideon cross-referenced the property maps against the survey records, which was the part that required going back and forth between papers, and was tedious enough that he had to get up twice to keep from losing his place. Cord fell asleep at the kitchen table around 8 in the morning with his head on his arms. Nobody woke him. By midday, they had it. A case file, organized, clear, with a handwritten index in Isabella's neat small handwriting and a 2-page cover summary that laid out the pattern from the beginning. Hanford's dual surveys, the manufactured assessments, the forged document, the intimidation of hands, the systematic targeting of ranches along the water route. It was not a courtroom argument. That was for Fitch to build. But it was something that a lawyer could pick up, read, and understand completely in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. Russell held the finished file and looked at it for a long time. "I've been in this valley since 1875, he said. "My wife is buried on our East Hill. My 2 sons grew up on that ranch." He set the file down carefully. "I was starting to think maybe the time had come to sell. Let the younger generation fight it." He looked at Isabella. "I'm glad you were in Gideon's study that first morning." Isabella looked startled, briefly. It was an unusual thing for her. That momentary loss of composure, quickly recovered. "I didn't do anything a careful person couldn't have done," she said. "Maybe," Russell said, "but you were the one who did it." That afternoon, while Russell rested in the spare room and Cord resumed his watch on the perimeter, Gideon found Isabella on the porch. She was sitting on the top step with her back against the post, and she had the case file in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking out at the mountains. He sat down on the step below her, which put his shoulders roughly level with her knees, and looked at the mountains too. "The train was this morning," she said. "I know." "Next one's a week from Friday." "I know that too." She was quiet. He could feel her looking at the side of his face. "Gideon," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "When this is over, when Fitch has come and done what he does, and the cooperative is filed or not filed and Crow has been dealt with one way or another," she paused. "What do you want?" He sat with the question, not performing sitting with it, actually sitting with it, because it deserved that. "You," he said. He said it simply and without dressing it up, because she was the kind of person who would see through anything he dressed it up as, and he'd rather just say the true thing. I want to see what this could be. You and me. This house. I want to know if the house feels like this after 3 weeks, and 3 months, and a year." She was quiet. "I can't promise it goes easily," he said. I'm difficult to live with. I've been alone a long time, and I've gotten bad habits, and I don't talk enough about things that matter, and I work myself past the point of sense, and I know," she said. "I'm telling you the real picture." "I know," she said again. "I'm not looking for the perfect picture." A pause. "I haven't had an easy thing in a long time. I'm not afraid of hard." He turned and looked up at her. She looked back down at him with those clear green eyes, and there was something in her face that he recognized in a distant way, something he thought he'd forgotten how to see. The particular expression of someone who had been holding themselves very carefully for a long time and was considering cautiously the possibility of not having to. "The train's not until next Friday," he said. "That's what I said." "A lot can happen in a week." "A lot happened in 3 days," she said. He almost smiled. He wasn't quite there, but it was close. "Stay," he said. "Not for the lawyer, not for the documents." He held her gaze. "Stay, because I'm asking you to." She looked at him for a long moment. The mountains were doing what mountains did in the afternoon light, going amber and then rose at the high faces, the snow catching the sun at angles that made the whole range look like it was quietly showing off. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, "when you've slept. I'll ask you the same thing tomorrow." "I know you will," she said. "I just want to hear it twice." He turned back to the mountains. She went back to the file in her lap. The afternoon settled around them warm and clear, the way Montana afternoons sometimes did after the worst of the storm, like the world was sorry it had been so rough and was trying to make it up to you. Somewhere down in the yard, Burl was talking quietly to one of the horses. Cord was making a circuit of the fence line, visible for a moment at the north corner, and then gone over the rise. Inside the house, Russell Kellerman was sleeping the deep sleep of a 71-year-old man who had not slept properly in weeks and had finally, for the first time, felt the weight lift slightly. Tomorrow Fitch would arrive from Helena, and the real legal fight would begin. Tomorrow Crow would make another move because men like Crow did not stop until they were stopped. Tomorrow, there would be hard conversations and harder decisions and no guarantee of how any of it landed. But right now the porch was warm and the case file was finished, and the man who had ridden into Cedar Ridge 4 days ago, absolutely certain of everything, sat on the steps below a woman who had arrived with 17 cents and was the best thing that had happened to this ranch in 4 years. And neither of them said anything for a while, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that meant both of them intended to still be here when tomorrow came. Aldous Fitch arrived on the morning stage from Helena, which was 40 minutes late because one of the wheel pins had worked loose on the downgrade and the driver had stopped to fix it rather than gamble on the canyon road, which was the correct decision, but meant Fitch walked into Cedar Ridge at 9:30 instead of 9 sharp. And he was a man who did not enjoy being late. He was smaller than Gideon expected. Medium height, thin, somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had been sharp once and had gotten sharper with age rather than softer. He wore a good coat that had seen considerable travel and carried a leather case that looked like it weighed more than he did. He had a precise, economical way of moving that said he did not waste energy on anything that wasn't necessary. Gideon met him at the stage office. They shook hands. "Your telegram mentioned documents," Fitch said before any other pleasantry. "I've got them at the ranch." "Then let's go to the ranch." They rode out together, Fitch on a hired horse from the livery that he managed competently, if not gracefully, and Gideon gave him the broad shape of the situation on the way: Crow, the assessments, the surveys, the forged signature at the Braxton place. Fitch listened with his eyes on the road ahead and occasionally asked a question that was short and specific and landed exactly in the middle of whatever Gideon had been about to say next. When they rode into the yard, Isabella was on the porch. She had the case file under her arm and a cup of coffee in her other hand, and she looked like she had slept, finally, which was a relief. She'd gone to bed late, and Gideon had heard her up at some point in the small hours, but she'd been asleep when he passed her door at 5. She came down the steps as they dismounted. "Mr. Fitch," Gideon said, "this is Isabella Whitmore." She put together the case file. Fitch looked at her with the direct, assessing look of a man who evaluated people quickly because his work required it. He looked at the file under her arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "show me. Put down." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Isabella walked Fitch through it the way she'd walked Russell through it, without preamble, without performance, just the documents in sequence and the logic connecting them. Fitch asked more questions than Russell had, and harder ones, and twice he stopped her mid-explanation and went back 2 documents to check something against something else. He found 2 connections she hadn't made, which she acknowledged without defensiveness and incorporated without delay. Gideon sat at the end of the table and watched it happen and drank 3 cups of coffee and said very little, because there was very little for him to add and he knew it. At the end of the 2 hours, Fitch sat back in his chair and looked at the spread of papers and was quiet for a long moment. "The forged signature is the most important thing here," he said. "I thought so too," Isabella said. "Not because it's the worst crime. The systematic fraud is worse, broader, but because it's the most provable." He tapped the Braxton document. "Handwriting examination. If Braxton can swear he never signed this and we can put that signature in front of an examiner..." He paused. "Who else knows about this document?" "Russell Kellerman. He brought it to us. Frank Dunmore knows the situation generally." Isabella paused. "Crow's men don't know we have the specific Braxton document. We didn't show it at Dunmore's." Fitch looked at her. "Good. Keep it that way." He was quiet again, thinking. "The cooperative filing is possible. I've done similar structures in 2 other counties. It will take 3 to 4 weeks to draft properly, but I can file a preliminary notice of intent that establishes the joint claim before anything else moves." He looked at Gideon. "What I need is a meeting, every rancher Crow has targeted, in one room, in the next 48 hours. "Russell can reach them," Gideon said. "I need them to bring their original filing records if they have them, anything dated before 1880. I'll send cord to Kellerman this afternoon." "Good." Fitch began straightening the papers carefully, in the order Isabella had arranged them. "Miss Whitmore, I'll need you at the meeting." She looked slightly surprised. "Me?" "You understand these documents better than anyone in this valley except me, and I've only had them for 2 hours." He was matter-of-fact about it. "When a rancher has a question about what he's looking at, I don't want to be the only person who can answer it. 2 voices are more convincing than one, and frankly..." He paused. People trust someone who can show them the specific line in the specific document. You can do that faster than I can. All right, she said. Fitch nodded and closed the case file. Now, Gideon, tell me about Crow himself, not the documents. The man. The meeting happened on the second day at Russell Kellerman's ranch, which was the most central location, and also because Russell's barn was the largest available space and they needed the room. 9 ranchers came. Some drove wagons, some rode. One, old George Placer, who was 83 years old and had been in the valley longer than anyone, including Russell, came in a buckboard driven by his granddaughter because his eyes weren't good enough for riding anymore. His granddaughter, a capable-looking young woman named Ada, tied off the horses herself and then sat in the back of the buckboard and waited with her arms crossed, watching everything. Gideon counted the faces as they came in. Some he knew well. Some he knew by name and not much more. The Dunmore brothers, Frank and his younger brother Cal, who had a ranch on the South Fork. The Braxton family, Bill Braxton and his wife Elena, who had found the forged document and was carrying it in her coat pocket like evidence she was afraid to let out of her hands. 2 ranchers from the East Valley, the Phelps brothers, who had ridden 40 miles to be here and had the road dust to prove it. And the town doctor, which surprised Gideon, Emmett Morse, who ran the Cedar Ridge practice, and also, Gideon hadn't realized, held a water allotment on a small piece of land north of town that his wife had inherited. Emmett had no cattle. He just had land and water rights that were apparently also on Crow's list. They stood in Russell's barn in the morning cold, breath coming visible in the air, and Fitch laid it out for them. He was good at it. Gideon had expected a lawyer's delivery, careful, qualified, hedged. Fitch was careful and precise, but he wasn't hedged. He said what the document showed, what it meant, and what the options were in language that didn't require a law degree to follow. When he got to the forged signature, he paused and looked at Elena Braxton. "Mrs. Braxton," he said, "would you be willing to state to this group what you told me this morning?" Elena Braxton was a small woman with red hair going gray and the kind of stillness that came from having weathered serious things without being destroyed by them. She reached into her coat and produced the document. "My husband never signed this," she said. "I know his signature. I have 30 years of his signature on every piece of paper we've ever filed. This," she held it up. "This is not it." The barn went quiet in a particular way. Old George Placer from the back said, "How many more of those do you think are out there?" "We don't know yet," Fitch said, "but I'd ask every person here to look through their records in the next week for documents you don't remember signing or receiving." He paused. "Bring anything you find to Gideon Ashcroft's ranch. Miss Whitmore will look at it." Every head in the barn turned, and Gideon watched Isabella receive that attention without stepping back from it, standing beside Fitch at the front of the group, with the case file under her arm and the steady gaze she brought to everything. And if she was uncomfortable being looked at by 9 families who'd heard rumors about her all week, she didn't show it. "She found the original pattern," Fitch said. "She put together what you're all looking at. If you've got a question about a specific document, she can answer it better than I can." Bill Braxton spoke from the middle of the group. "I heard you came out here as a mail-order bride." He said it bluntly, but without hostility. The tone of a man who believed in naming what was in the room. "No offense intended, I just want to know who I'm trusting with my family's land records." "None taken," Isabella said. She met his eyes directly. "I came as a mail-order bride. I'm not married. I'm here because Gideon asked me to stay and because I found something in his files that mattered and wanted to see it through." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a surveyor. What I am is someone who spent years keeping records for people who couldn't afford mistakes, and learned to see when records have been made to deceive." She held Braxton's gaze. "You can trust me or not trust me, but you can check everything I've told Mr. Fitch against the documents yourself. They say what they say. I didn't write them." A moment of quiet. Then Ada Placer's voice came from outside through the barn door. "She's right, Grandpa. I read them this morning. The documents say exactly what she said." A few people looked toward the door. Nobody laughed, but the air in the barn shifted. Bill Braxton nodded. "Once. That was all, but it was enough." Fitch moved on to the cooperative structure. He explained how it would work, the joint filing, the shared water rights management, the legal standing it would give them collectively against any future claim. He was honest about the complexity and the time it would take. He was also honest about what happened if they didn't do it. He's going to keep going, Fitch said. That's the thing you need to understand about a man running this kind of operation. He doesn't have an exit plan that involves stopping. Either he gets what he's after, or he gets stopped. There's no middle ground where he decides you've been too much trouble and goes elsewhere. He looked around the barn. This valley is his plan, all of it, and every one of you is a piece of it. The Phelps brothers looked at each other. The older one, Gideon thought his name was Harvey, said, "What does it cost?" "The legal filing." Fitch named a number. It was not small. Harvey Phelps turned the number over for a moment. "Split how many ways?" "However many ranches file jointly. The more, the smaller, each share." Harvey looked at his brother. His brother gave him a look that meant they'd already discussed this on the 40-mile ride and had their answer. "We're in," Harvey said. One by one, they came in. The Dunmore brothers together. The Braxtons. Bill looked at Elena, and Elena gave him a nod that was clearly the definitive vote in the Braxton household. Russell had been in since the beginning, hadn't needed to be asked. Dr. Morse, who'd said almost nothing the entire meeting, raised his hand quietly and said, "My wife's land too, if that's acceptable." "Any legal title holder can join," Fitch said. Old George Placer said from the back, "I'm 83 years old. I've been in this valley since before half these mountains had names on a map. I'm not selling anything to anybody." He paused. "Put me down." 9 ranches. 11 water allotments when you counted the Braxton's additional section and Morse's wife's parcel. When it was done and the papers were being circulated for the preliminary signatures Fitch needed, Gideon found himself standing beside Russell near the barn door, both of them looking out at the yard where people were talking in the cold. "How did Crow not see this coming?" Russell said. "He saw it," Gideon said. "He just thought he'd be faster. He underestimated something." Gideon looked at Isabella, who was across the yard talking to Elena Braxton. Both of them bent over a document, Elena pointing at something specific. "Several things," he said. Russell made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close. The response came that afternoon, and it was not papers this time. Gideon was at the fence on the west pasture, the last of the cut section from 4 days ago, when Burl came riding hard from the north. Hard enough that Gideon dropped the wire and moved to meet him. "Rider at the house," Burl said. "One man, asking for you." "Who?" "Says his name is Holt. Never seen him before." Gideon rode back. The man in the yard was not Pruitt. He was younger than Pruitt, leaner, with the kind of face that was hard to remember specifically because there was nothing specific in it. He was sitting on a dark horse and had both hands visible, resting on the saddle horn, which was either courtesy or a practiced performance of courtesy. "Mr. Ashcroft," the man said. "My name's Holt. I work for Mr. Crow." "What do you want, Holt?" "To talk. Just talk." He stayed on the horse, which was either respect for the space or a preference for the position. "Mr. Crow has heard about the meeting this morning." "Of course he has." "He'd like to propose a settlement." Gideon waited. "He's willing to drop the water assessment claims, all of them, and he'll deed back the Harlow parcel, the one his company acquired last year, to be held in common by the Valley ranchers." Holt said it without inflection, like he was reading from a list. "In exchange, the ranchers withdraw the cooperative filing, and Miss Whitmore leaves the territory within the week." The yard was very quiet. "Say that last part again," Gideon said. "Miss Whitmore leaves the territory. Within the week." "Get off my property," Gideon said. Holt didn't move immediately. "Mr. Ashcroft, the offer? She's not part of any negotiation. She's not a bargaining piece. She's not something to be traded away." He kept his voice level because the alternative was something he couldn't afford right now. "Get off my property. Tell Crow the answer is no and will stay no. Tell him we'll see him in front of a judge." Holt looked at him for a moment longer, then turned the horse and rode out at an easy pace, like a man who delivered a message and whether it was received was not his department. Gideon stood in the yard until the rider was out of sight. Isabella came out of the house. She'd heard some of it from the window. He could see that in her face. "He offered to trade you," Gideon said. "You're leaving, in exchange for dropping the claims." She didn't look surprised. She looked like she'd considered this possibility and was not glad to be right about it. "He's frightened," she said. "That's what this is." "I know what it is. I told him no." She looked at him. "You should have asked me first." He stared at her. Asked you? It was a choice that affects me directly. You should have asked me what I wanted before you decided. She wasn't angry, exactly. She was precise, making a specific point with specific care. I would have said no too, obviously, but you should have asked. He held her gaze. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he was about to say so when the sound of horses on the east road stopped him. Not one horse. Several. He turned. 4 riders coming in from the east road, Pruitt in front. 3 men behind him that Gideon didn't know, and at least one of them was carrying a rifle across his saddle, which was not an ambiguous message. Get inside, Gideon said to Isabella. Gideon, Isabella, inside. She went. He was grateful she went without the argument, because there wasn't time for it. Burl materialized from the barn. Burl always materialized, with the old Winchester that lived on the tack room wall, held in both hands but not raised. Cord came out of the bunkhouse at a run and stopped when he read the yard. Pruitt pulled up 20 feet out. Ashcroft, he said, we're here to collect the documents. What documents? The ones the woman found in your files, and whatever was brought to the meeting this morning. Pruitt's voice was flat and businesslike. Mr. Crow is prepared to get a court order, but he'd rather handle it privately. He can get whatever order he wants. He's not getting anything from this ranch. That's not the smart answer. It's the only answer I have. Pruitt looked past him at Burl with the rifle, then at Cord, then at the house, where Gideon was very aware that Isabella was somewhere behind the front window. You're one ranch, Pruitt said. You've got 2 men. This morning I had 9 ranches, Gideon said. You think only 2 of them knew to be ready for something like this? It was a gamble. He had not actually arranged anything of the kind with the other ranchers after the meeting. He had thought about it and not had time, but it was the kind of gamble that costs nothing if the other person believed it. Pruitt looked at him steadily. And then, from the north ridge, a rider appeared. Then 2 more beside him, coming down at a pace that was not casual. Russell Kellerman and the Phelps brothers, who apparently had not gone straight home after the meeting. Pruitt looked at the ridge, looked back at Gideon. Mr. Crow's going to hear about this, he said. He already knows about all of it, Gideon said. That's why you're here. Pruitt turned his horse. The 3 men with him turned with him. They rode out east at the same unhurried pace that Holt had used, and Gideon stood in his yard and watched them go. Russell reached the yard a few minutes later with Harvey and Walt Phelps behind him. Russell looked at the east road where the dust was still settling. We decided to take the long way home, Harvey Phelps said. I'm glad you did, Gideon said. Figured you might be. Harvey looked at the house. Everybody all right? We're all right. Isabella came out onto the porch and looked at Russell and the Phelps brothers and said, There's coffee if you want it, and went back inside because that was who she was. The crisis passes, the coffee matters, keep moving. Russell got down from his horse with the slow, careful movement of a 71-year-old man who'd been in a saddle too long. He's going to push harder now, he said to Gideon, low enough for just the 2 of them. I know. How long before Fitch can file the preliminary notice? He said 2 days if we get the signatures back to him. Then we get him the signatures. Russell looked at the house and then at Gideon. She holding up all right? Better than I am. Russell made that not-quite laugh sound again. Smart man, that one who picked her, he said, and went inside for the coffee. The signatures came in faster than anyone expected. Bill Braxton rode them in personally the next morning, with Elena's signature already on her line and 3 other ranchers he'd collected on his way, people Fitch hadn't even reached yet, who had heard about the meeting from their neighbors and wanted in. Dr. Morse sent his wife's signature with a note that said she'd have brought it herself, but she was delivering a baby on the South Fork and couldn't be specific about the timing. Fitch filed the preliminary notice in Cedar Ridge that afternoon. The county recorder, a thin, nervous man named Spivey, who had always been polite to Gideon and now had the look of someone whose polite-to-everyone policy was being severely tested, took the filing with both hands and looked at it for a long moment. This is a large filing, Spivey said. It is, Fitch agreed pleasantly. Mr. Crow has also filed this morning. Spivey set the papers down very carefully. His filing references a water assessment lien on 4 properties. I'm aware, Fitch said. Is there a conflict with our filing? Spivey looked at the preliminary notice again. Then he looked at Fitch. Then he looked at Gideon, who was standing slightly behind Fitch in the way of someone who is there to be visible rather than to speak. "I'll need to review both filings," he said, "per standard procedure." "Of course," Fitch said. "We'll be here." They weren't actually in the office for the review. They waited outside on the bench while Spivey did whatever Spivey did with documents. And while they waited, Gideon watched the street. Cedar Ridge went about its business around them. The feed store. The barber. The two old men who seemed to exist exclusively on that bench. Martha Bellows walked past on the far side of the street and saw Gideon and saw Isabella beside him and looked away with the particular expression of someone recalibrating a narrative they'd already told 6 people. "She's going to have to find something new to talk about," Isabella said, not looking at Martha. "She will," Gideon said. "Give her a week." "A week for what?" "To find the new story." He paused. "By then there'll be a real one worth telling." She glanced at him. He kept his eyes on the street, but he could feel the glance. Spivey took 40 minutes. When he came out, he looked tired in the way of a man who has been a small cog in a large machine and has just realized the machine is not what he thought it was. "The cooperative filing takes precedence," he said, "by date of original filing, which is 1875 for the earliest member." He folded his hands in front of him. "Mr. Crow's counsel will have the opportunity to contest the preliminary notice within 30 days. "And the assessment liens?" Fitch asked. Spivey was quiet for a moment. "I've cross-referenced the assessment numbers against the county's own ledger," he said slowly. "Several of them. I'll want to review this more carefully, but several of them don't appear to correspond to any filed record in this office." Fitch said nothing. He waited. "I'll be sending a letter to the territorial attorney's office," Spivey said, "as a matter of procedural obligation." He looked at Gideon. "I should have looked more carefully, sooner. I'm sorry for that." Gideon looked at the man. Spivey was not Crow's conspirator. He was just a man who had filed papers without asking enough questions, which was not the same thing. "The Braxtons have a document with a signature that may require a separate investigation," Gideon said. "If your office can assist in connecting the right authorities—" "I'll make that letter very clear," Spivey said quietly. They walked out of the land office into the afternoon sun, and Fitch said without any change in his careful face, "That went better than I expected." "Better how?" Gideon said. "Spivey's a decent man in a hard position. He could have stalled. He didn't." Fitch adjusted his coat. "We're not done. Crow's counsel will contest, and that process will take months. But the preliminary notice is filed. The forged document evidence is now in official hands, and 11 ranches are on record as a single legal entity." He looked at Gideon. "He can't quietly pick you off anymore. Whatever he does now, he has to do it in the open." And doing it in the open, it turned out, was something Silas Crow was not willing to do. The news came through 3 different sources inside the next week, the way news in a small territory always came. Overlapping, inconsistent in the details, but consistent in the fact. Crow had stopped at Helena on his way out. He was pulling his capital out of the county, selling his livestock contracts, letting his remaining hands go. One of those hands, a young man who'd worked Crow's North Range and apparently had a conscience he'd been sitting on, came to Fitch voluntarily and gave a statement about what he'd witnessed over 3 years. The statement was long. It covered the manufactured assessments, the directed fence cuts, including Gideon's, the payment to a man named Hanford for the dual surveys, and one other thing, which was that Pruitt, Dex Pruitt himself, had been to the Pruitt family's place the night before their hand was beaten on the road, and Pruitt had been the one to give the order. That information went to the territorial marshal's office, which was a different office than the county recorder's and had different authority. Pruitt was in Cedar Ridge when the marshal's men came for him. He did not go quietly, but he went. Gideon heard about it secondhand from Cord, who had been in town for feed and had witnessed it from outside the barber shop with the 2 old men on the bench. He came home and told Isabella, who was in the kitchen garden, the actual garden, now, not the weed field, on her knees with a trowel and Russell Kellerman's spare hat because she'd left her own inside and the sun was direct. She sat back on her heels when he finished. "Pruitt," she said, "in custody. Crow is apparently gone. They're looking for him." She turned the trowel in her hands. "He'll have somewhere to go. A man like that plans for the exit." "Probably. But he can't come back." She looked at Gideon. "If he comes back, Fitch is waiting. The territorial attorney is waiting. Spivey has already given his statement. She paused. He's done here. Gideon crouched down to her level, which put him with his forearms on his knees and his face close to level with hers. She had dirt on both hands and the hat was slightly too big, and she looked, honest was the word, he always came back to that word with her. She looked like exactly what she was, in exactly the place she was, without any gap between those two things. I asked you something a week ago, he said. She looked at him steadily. I asked if you'd stay, and you told me to ask you again when I'd slept. I remember. I've slept since then. He held her gaze. Several times. I keep asking you the same thing. He paused. The train leaves tomorrow morning. I know when the train leaves. I want you to stay. Not for documents. Not for Fitch. Not for the ranchers. He said it plainly, the same way he'd said it the first time. For me. Because when I ride out to the south fence and come back, the first thing I think about is telling you what I saw. Because the house sounds different with you in it, and I've learned to like the difference. Because He stopped. I was becoming someone I didn't want to be, alone, getting used to it. And then you stepped off a train with 17 cents and a crushed hat, and you found things I'd missed for 3 years, and you sat in a line cabin and told me the truth about fear. And I'd rather fight through whatever is hard between us than get back on the road toward who I was getting to be. She was quiet. The garden around them smelled like turned earth and mint, and the carrots she'd saved from 2 years of neglect. It's not going to be easy, she said. I know that. You don't talk about things. You have to learn to talk about things. I know that too. And I'm not easy either. I have opinions about everything, and I don't like being managed, and I will go through your files without asking if I think something needs going through. She met his eyes. I'm telling you the real picture. He almost smiled. She had used his exact words, from the porch, back to him. I know, he said. I want the real picture. She looked at him for a long moment. The hat was too big, and her knees were dirty, and somewhere behind the house, Cord was whistling something off-key, and the mountains sat behind it all the way they always did, indifferent and enormous and strangely reassuring. Then I'll stay, she said. For real this time. Not until the next train. He reached out and put his hand over hers, the dirty one with the trowel in it, and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back. They stayed like that for a moment, crouched in the garden, not performing anything, just two imperfect people holding on. We should tell Margaret, Isabella said. He laughed, actually laughed, which was a sound that surprised him coming from his own throat. She's going to be insufferable about it. She's going to be insufferable about it for years, Isabella agreed. There was something in her voice when she said it, not just the humor of it, but the years in it. The word years, said easily, like it was a reasonable thing to plan for, like it was something she intended to be around for. She'll deserve it, he said. She was right. Don't tell her that. I'll have to eventually. Eventually, she agreed. Not today. He stood up and helped her up, and they walked back toward the house together, leaving the garden with its recovered carrots and conquered mint. And the mountains watched the way mountains do, which is without comment or judgment, just the steadiness of things that have been standing longer than any of this and intend to keep standing. The house had a light in the window already. Burl had gone in ahead of them, for once, and started the stove before being asked. Gideon held the door for her. She went in. He followed, and the door closed behind them, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a place where the immediate danger has passed, and the work of building something better is just beginning, which is not the end of anything at all. Margaret arrived 3 days after Isabella said she'd stay. She didn't send word ahead. She simply appeared on a Wednesday morning in a hired wagon with 2 bags and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for permission to come and had decided that waiting any longer was unreasonable. She pulled up in the yard, looked at the house, looked at the garden where the mint was cut back and the carrot rows were visible and the porch rail had a new board in it, and then she looked at Gideon, who had come out to meet her with his arms crossed, and the particular face he wore when he was trying to look less pleased than he was. Don't, he said. I haven't said anything, Margaret said, climbing down from the wagon. You were about to. I was about to say hello. She smoothed her coat and looked at the house again and then at him. Hello, Gideon. Hello, Margaret. Isabella came out onto the porch, and Margaret turned and looked at her with the attention of someone who had been imagining this moment for longer than was probably reasonable. Isabella came down the steps and put out her hand. "Miss Ashcroft," she said. "I'm Isabella." Margaret took her hand and held it for a moment instead of shaking it, which was a Margaret thing to do. She looked at Isabella the way she might look at a piece of news she'd been expecting and still needed to sit with. "I know who you are," she said. "I've been corresponding with Fitch, and Russell Kellerman wrote to me." She paused. "I understand you've been keeping my brother from losing his water rights." "He was doing that himself," Isabella said. "I just helped find the paperwork." Margaret looked at Gideon with an expression that said, "I like her, and also, I told you so, and also, you're welcome, all three things at once without saying any of them." "Come inside," Gideon said. "I'll get the bags." "I can get my own." "Margaret." She let him get the bags. She stayed a week, and the week was not uncomplicated, because Margaret was not an uncomplicated person. She had strong opinions about where things should go in the kitchen, which put her in direct conflict with Isabella, who had reorganized the kitchen 2 weeks ago on entirely logical grounds and was not interested in reorganizing it again. They had a conversation about it on the second day that started politely and ended with both of them talking at the same time, and then a short silence, and then Isabella said, "You're right about the flour, actually," and Margaret said, "You're right about the pots," and after that they were fine. Gideon stayed out of it. He had developed in his years of knowing Margaret a refined instinct for which of her situations required intervention and which required simply staying in the barn until it resolved, and this was clearly the latter. What he hadn't expected was what happened on the third evening. He came in late from the south pasture, later than he meant to, and the house was quiet in a way that didn't mean empty. It meant everyone inside was doing something that absorbed them. He came through the kitchen and found it clean and dim, with just the lamp on the table, and followed the low sound of voices to the front room. Margaret and Isabella were sitting on the settee. Not side by side exactly. Margaret had her feet tucked up beneath her and Isabella was angled toward her, and they were talking in the low, specific way of women who have moved past the polite layer of conversation into something actual. Gideon stopped in the doorway because neither of them had heard him yet, and what he heard was his sister saying, "He put the headstone up himself, wouldn't let anyone help. It took him 3 days and he didn't talk to anybody the whole time." And Isabella said quietly, "He carries things alone. He always has. Even when Clara was alive, it was better with her. She knew when to push." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He needs someone who knows when to push." "I know," Isabella said, and then, "I'm not Clara." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "I know that. I wasn't looking for Clara. Clara's gone and she's not coming back, and Gideon he needed someone who was here, who was present, who wanted to be in his life rather than in his grief." A pause. "I wrote that advertisement 9 months ago. I almost took it back twice." "What stopped you?" "The third time I came to this house and watched him eat alone at that table." Margaret's voice was even, not dramatic. "It stopped me then, and it stopped me every time after." Gideon backed away from the doorway very quietly and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark for a while. He wasn't eavesdropping exactly. He just heard what he heard, and now he needed a minute with it. He thought about Clara. He did that, thought about Clara, in a way that was different than it had been even 3 weeks ago. Not less. That wasn't the right word. More settled, maybe. More like looking at a photograph of someone you loved deeply than like standing at the edge of something you couldn't survive. Clara had been gone for 4 years, and the grief of that was still real, and would probably always be real in some form, but it had stopped being the only true thing. He thought about Thomas, which was harder. That one he still couldn't stay with for long. The age Thomas would have been now, the things he would have been doing. He sat with that until it eased back, which it eventually did, and then he got up and made coffee and called through to the front room that it was ready, and the 2 women came to the kitchen and they all 3 sat around the table together, and Margaret talked too much as she always did, and Isabella made the occasional precise comment that redirected the conversation in ways Margaret didn't always notice, and Gideon mostly listened, which was his natural state and which felt, for the first time in a long time, like enough. Fitch wrote in the 4th week. The Territorial Attorney's Office had opened a formal investigation into Crow's assessment records. The handwriting examination on the Braxton document had confirmed what Elena Braxton already knew. The signature was not her husband's. 3 more documents from other ranchers had since been identified as likely forgeries, which added considerably to the weight of the case. Crow himself had been located in Wyoming, which was outside immediate territorial jurisdiction, but not outside the reach of the investigation. Fitch's letter was careful about what he predicted. He was not a man who made predictions in writing, but the shape of what he described was a man whose structure had been exposed and who had no remaining leverage to hold it up. Pruitt had, in the language of Fitch's careful letter, entered into a cooperative arrangement with the territorial attorney, which meant Pruitt was talking. Gideon read the letter twice and then gave it to Isabella, who read it once and handed it back. "It's not over yet," she said, "but the weight is moving in the right direction. Fitch thinks the cooperative filing will be confirmed within 60 days. 60 days. She said it in a way that was measuring something. That's enough time to get the fall water allocation set before the dry season. This was a thing about Isabella that he had been learning in layers. Over the weeks since she'd said she was staying, she thought in terms of what needed doing next. Not in a blunt, unfeeling way. She felt things. He'd seen that clearly enough. But she had a habit of moving forward through hard things toward useful things. And once the hard thing was named and acknowledged, her instinct was always, all right, now what can we do? He found it steadying in a way he hadn't expected. He was a man who could get stuck in the weight of something. She didn't get stuck. She'd had too much practice surviving things to let herself get stuck. "I'll write to Fitch about the water allocation," Gideon said, "and to Russell. He'll want to convene the cooperative members before the fall." She paused. "Also, the Phelps brothers mentioned a surveyor they trust. If we're going to establish correct boundary lines across all 11 properties, we should do it before winter closes the high passes." He looked at her. "Do you ever stop?" She considered this. "When I'm asleep," she said. "Sometimes." He laughed, and she smiled at it, and it was one of those ordinary moments that didn't announce itself as important while it was happening. They were married in October, 6 weeks after Fitch's letter arrived and 3 days before the first real frost. It was not a large wedding. Gideon had not wanted large, and Isabella had no family to fill the space anyway, which was a fact she named plainly without asking for anything about it. Margaret was there, which was inevitable and also right. Russell Kellerman came, moving stiffly in his good coat, and sat in the third row with his hat on his knees and the expression of a man who was genuinely glad for something. The Dunmore brothers came. Elena Braxton came without Bill, who was down with a bad knee, but she brought a jar of preserved pears that she pressed into Isabella's hands at the door and said, "From my kitchen. It's not much." And Isabella said, "It's exactly right." Cord wore a shirt that had been ironed very recently and very badly, with the collar sitting slightly wrong, and he kept reaching up to adjust it, which didn't help. Burl sat beside him in the small Cedar Ridge hall, in the dark suit he apparently owned and had maintained without anyone ever knowing about it, and said nothing and looked entirely at ease. Dr. Morse came with his wife, who turned out to be a small, energetic woman named Frances, who shook hands with everyone and had strong opinions about the arrangement of chairs that she voiced freely and without apparent expectation that anyone would take them seriously. Old George Placer could not make the trip from his ranch, but Ada drove in alone in the buckboard and handed Gideon a sealed letter from George at the door. He read it later, in private. It was 4 sentences, in the shaky handwriting of a man whose hands had been working in weather for 83 years, and it said, "Your father was a decent man. Your grandfather was a decent man. I knew both. I think you are too, and I think the woman you're marrying knows what she's getting and wants it anyway, which is what matters." Gideon folded that letter and kept it. The ceremony was short because neither of them wanted a long ceremony, and the justice of the peace, a man named Harker, who had been doing this for 20 years and had the comfortable efficiency of someone who genuinely liked his job, moved through it at a pace that was respectful without being slow. When it was done, and Harker said the appropriate words, Gideon looked at Isabella in her good dress, not white, deep blue, the color of late evening sky, and she looked back at him with those green eyes that had never once pretended to see him as something he wasn't, and something in his chest that had been braced for 4 years released in a way that was quiet rather than dramatic, like a knot worked loose by patient hands rather than cut. He had stood at Clara's grave and made himself a promise about never. He didn't think of that promise as broken. He thought of it as something he'd made from a place of complete pain and complete isolation, and pain and isolation were not reliable architects of permanent decisions. Clara had loved him, and she had been a practical woman, and Gideon could not believe, that she would have wanted the never. Thomas would have been 5 years old. He'd have been into everything. That thought could still knock the breath from Gideon if he let it arrive unguarded, and it arrived now briefly during the ceremony, and he let it arrive and let it settle, and it settled into the same place everything settled, into the ground of his life, part of its history, held rather than escaped. Margaret cried. She tried not to and failed and blew her nose into her handkerchief with considerable force, and then looked at Gideon with red eyes and a defiant expression that said, "Don't you dare say anything." He didn't say anything. He would have had to be a much different man to miss what this moment meant to his sister, who had written an advertisement and almost taken it back twice, and had been right anyway. After, at the small gathering at the hall, Francis Morse had won the chair arrangement battle through sheer persistence. Russell Kellerman found Gideon beside the window with a cup of something warm and stood next to him looking out at the street. "Your father would have been glad," Russell said. "I think so. He worried about you after Clara." Russell said it in the way of old men who have known families across generations, with the bluntness that comes from outliving the obligation to soften things. "He told me once he was afraid you'd get too good at being alone." Gideon looked at his coffee cup. "He wasn't wrong to be afraid of it." "No, but you didn't." Russell looked at Isabella across the room, where she was talking to Ada Placer, with her hands moving in the way they moved when she was explaining something she found genuinely interesting. "She's going to be good for this valley, you know, not just for you, for all of it." "She's already started," Gideon said. He meant it literally. In the weeks between the morning she'd said she was staying, and this afternoon, Isabella had done 3 specific things beyond the ranch work and the legal documents. She had helped Francis Morse organize the Cedar Ridge Women's Mutual Aid Society, which had existed in an informal and disorganized way for years, and now had a charter and a treasury and a meeting schedule. She had ridden out to the Braxton place twice to help Elena update the ranch accounts, at Elena's request, and had found in the process that the Braxtons were paying substantially more for their cattle contracts than the market warranted, a discrepancy that the cooperative would address in the spring. And she had sat with old Ada Placer for an entire afternoon, listening to Ada talk about the northern grazing patterns that 3 generations of Placers had tracked but never written down, and had then written them down herself in a clean ledger that she'd given Ada to keep. None of these things had been asked of her. She'd done them because she moved through the world, noticing what needed doing and having enough capacity to do it. "I know," Russell said, meaning the same thing Gideon meant. He picked up his hat. "I'm going to head out before dark. Knees." He said the word with the resigned authority of someone whose knees were an established fact of life rather than a complaint. "Give my regards to your wife." The word wife landed differently than Gideon expected. Not badly, just solidly. Like a good board in a repaired floor, something that would hold. "Safe ride, Russell," he said. Winter came the week after, and with it came the particular quality of life on a Montana ranch in the cold months, which was not romantic, and was not quiet in the way people who had never done it imagined. It was work at hours that didn't respect the dark, fingers that stopped working right at the worst moments, machinery that failed specifically when the temperature was lowest, animals that required attention regardless of what else was happening. Isabella worked. That was not a surprise. He'd known she would. What surprised him was specific things, caught at odd moments. The way she learned the particular sound of the water pump when it was about to freeze before he told her what to listen for. The way she could talk to the cattle in a low, even tone that settled them faster than anything he'd tried. The way she organized the winter provisions with a precision that turned out to prevent 3 separate crises that he wouldn't have seen coming until they were already crises. She also cried once, in January, in the kitchen in the early morning when she thought he was still asleep. He heard it and came downstairs and found her at the table with both hands around a cold cup of coffee, not making much noise, just sitting there with tears running down her face. He sat down across from her without saying anything. After a moment, she said, "I was thinking about my mother." He waited. She used to talk about a house, a real house, somewhere with a garden. She never had one. Isabella looked at the table. "I kept thinking about it this morning, that she never got it, and I did." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. It seems like an unkind way for things to go. Her not and me, yes. He looked at her. It's not unkind. It's just the way things go is not fair. I know that. Doesn't make it easier to feel it. No. She picked up the coffee cup and found it cold and set it back down. I'm all right. I'm not. This isn't a problem. I just needed a few minutes. You can have more than a few minutes. I know. She looked at him. Are you going to tell me something useful, or are you going to keep sitting there being very large and quiet? He almost smiled. I haven't figured out which is more useful yet. She looked at him for a moment with those clear eyes and then said, The large and quiet is fine. I just wanted to know you'd made a choice about it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that until the stove needed stoking, which it did about 10 minutes later, and then they both got up and got on with the morning. That was how it was, mostly. Not smooth, not easy, not the version of marriage that gets described in ways that make real marriage feel like a failure, by comparison. They disagreed about things. She thought he was too slow to ask for help from the other cooperative ranches. He thought she took on too much of other people's work alongside her own, and they had versions of this conversation several times in several forms without either of them fully converting the other. She had a habit of going silent when she was angry that was worse than shouting would have been, because he couldn't argue with silence. He had a habit of going out to the barn to think through hard things without telling her that was what he was doing, which she read as avoidance and which was, he'd eventually admitted, partly avoidance. They worked on it, not gracefully, with setbacks and the occasional conversation that went sideways and required being picked up and tried again the next day. The difference from being alone was not that things were easier. The difference was that they were worked on rather than accumulated in silence. Spring brought the confirmation of the cooperative filing. Fitch's letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 days into April with the ground just beginning to soften, and the letter said, in the restrained language of a man who had learned not to celebrate prematurely, that the territorial court had confirmed the Cedar Ridge Valley Water Cooperative as a legal entity with joint prior claim over the valley's water rights, and that Crow's contested filing had been dismissed with prejudice. Dismissed with prejudice meant it couldn't be refiled. That was the phrase Fitch had underlined, which was the only time Gideon had ever seen Fitch underline anything, and the underline meant something. The investigation into Crow was ongoing. He had not been found in Wyoming. He had moved on again, the way men who built things out of other people's losses tended to move when the structure collapsed. There was talk of California, or further. It was possible he would never be fully held to account in the legal way, which was an injustice that Gideon named to himself plainly and then set aside, because spending energy on what couldn't be fixed was the kind of thing that made a man bitter, and he had done enough of that. Pruitt had entered a plea. He would serve time. That was something. Russell convened a cooperative meeting the following week, the first formal meeting under the confirmed charter, and Isabella attended as the elected record keeper, which she had not sought but which had been proposed by Elena Braxton and seconded by Francis Morse and passed without anyone voting against it. She kept the minutes in the same neat handwriting she'd used for everything from the first morning in the study, and at the end of the meeting she read them back to the room and Harvey Phelps said, "That's exactly what was said," with genuine amazement, and his brother Walt said, "Harvey, close your mouth," which got a laugh. Gideon drove her home from that meeting in the wagon in the early spring evening, with the last of the light going pink over the mountains and the road soft under the wheels. "Record keeper," he said. "I didn't ask for it." "I know you didn't. That's why they gave it to you." She was quiet for a moment. Elena Braxton said something to me afterward. She said it mattered that someone had come here from outside, someone who didn't already know who everyone was and what everyone's history was. She said fresh eyes saw the pattern faster. She's right. Maybe. Isabella watched the mountains. "I've been thinking about that. About coming from outside." A pause. "I came here with nothing. I mean that in both directions. No money and no history, no expectations. And I think what I had instead of those things was just paying attention, because I had no reason not to." He looked at the road ahead. "That's worth more than people realize." "Until they need it," she agreed. He thought about the train platform, the single tear, the crushed hat, the 17 cents she'd said with such flat honesty when he'd asked. He thought, in that moment, that he was looking at someone with nothing. He understood now that he'd been looking at someone who had stripped everything down to what was essential and kept only that, and what was essential turned out to be considerable. He'd almost sent her back. That thought visited him sometimes, not as guilt exactly, but as the kind of awareness that keeps you from taking things for granted. He had almost sent her back, and the train had been there, and the plan had been firm, and the only thing that had moved him was a single tear on a cold platform that she probably hadn't even known was there. He was not a man who believed things happened for a reason in any arranged or intentional sense. Life was not in his experience organized that way. Things happened, and then other things happened, and the meaning you found in them was the meaning you made by how you lived through them. He had ridden into Cedar Ridge to send a stranger home. He had stayed because he couldn't put a woman with 17 cents in the street. He had let her look at the documents because she wouldn't sit still. And in every ordinary accidental step of it, something had built that he could not have designed or engineered or planned, because it wasn't the kind of thing you could plan. It was the kind of thing that happened when you didn't run from it. So, the graves on the East Hill were kept through every season. Gideon went up alone in November, when the ground was hard and the grass had gone brown. And he went up alone again in April when the first green was showing, and a few times at other moments when he felt the pull of it. He brought nothing, no flowers, no objects. He just went and stood for a while, with the valley spread below him and the mountains where they always were. Isabella knew he went. She didn't ask to come, and he didn't ask her to. This was his to do, in the particular private way of it, and she understood that without it needing to be explained. She was good at understanding what was his to carry and what she could take some of, and she didn't blur the line in either direction. Once, in the second winter, he came back from the hill, and she was waiting on the porch with coffee, and she handed him a cup and didn't say anything, and he took the coffee and stood there beside her and looked out at the valley, and that was all. That was enough. The cooperative held. That was the thing that Russell Kellerman said at the spring meeting of the second year, with the satisfied plainness of a man who'd watched a lot of things in his valley start and end. The cooperative held. It had. 6 months, then a year, then the spring confirmed it was not a temporary structure, but a settled one. Prices negotiated collectively were better than individual deals had ever been. Water allocations, set by the cooperative's documented rules rather than by who had the most leverage in a given season, were more stable and more just. When the Phelps brothers had a bad summer, drought hit their section harder than others. The cooperative's shared water management meant they didn't lose their herd, which they would have 2 years earlier without any recourse. Harvey Phelps said to Gideon at the fall roundup, "I'd have been gone by now," and didn't say anything else about it, which was all he needed to say. New families came into the valley. The Harlow parcel, the one Crow had deeded back as part of the settlement, was sold to a family named Duchesne, a couple in their 30s with 3 children and a competence about them that Gideon recognized immediately. When they arrived, Isabella rode out to introduce herself within the week and brought them a meal and the specific information about the valley's water system that would have taken them 2 years to learn on their own. Helene Duchesne, who was practical in the same way Isabella was practical, said later to Eleanor Morse, Francis's daughter, who had grown up and come back to help her father's practice, that she'd never been made to feel so quickly part of something. Cedar Ridge itself changed slowly, in the ordinary way of small towns that are doing all right. The barbershop got a new front. The general store expanded, and Harlan Abelson hired 2 more hands. Martha Bellows and Ida Crane found new things to talk about, which they always did, and the things they said about Isabella Ashcroft shifted, the way opinion shifts when it can no longer find purchase in the original story. Martha Bellows said to someone, Cord overheard it at the feed store and reported it with considerable satisfaction, that Isabella Ashcroft was one of the most capable women in the county and had done more for the valley than most people born there. She said it the way people say things they've arrived at reluctantly, which is often the most credible way to say them. Cord told this to Isabella directly because he had no filter and thought she would want to know. Isabella said, "Well," and went back to what she was doing, which was the best possible response. In the 3rd year, Russell Kellerman's health began to fail. Not dramatically. Russell was not a dramatic man, but steadily, in the way of a man past 70 whose body had worked very hard for a very long time and was beginning to present a bill. He still came to cooperative meetings, still rode his property when he could, still held his own opinion on every subject and expressed it without apology. But there were days he didn't ride, and the weight had come off him in ways that showed. And his granddaughter, a young woman named Clara, which Gideon privately noted without saying anything, had come to help run the ranch in ways that were no longer just help. Gideon rode up to Russell's place on a Tuesday evening in September with no specific reason except that he felt like it, and found Russell on his porch in the last of the light, looking out at his east hill. "Gideon," Russell said without looking over. "Russell, pull up a chair. I'm not getting up." Gideon pulled up the other chair and sat down. They looked at the valley together for a while. The light was doing what it did in September, long and golden and low, pulling everything into relief, making the grass look like something someone had lit deliberately. "I've been thinking," Russell said. "That's dangerous." "Yes," Russell's voice had the dry remnant of humor in it, even now. "I've been thinking about what this valley looked like 3 years ago, when every man in it was working alone and Crow was moving through it like water finding cracks." He was quiet. "And what it looks like now." Gideon looked at the valley. He knew what it looked like now. He'd been looking at it his whole life, and it looked the same in its mountains and its sky, and different in everything that human decision had made of it. It held, Gideon said. Russell's word given back. It held because someone was paying attention, Russell said. Someone who didn't know well enough to think it was too complicated, who just looked at it and said, "Here's the pattern, here's what it means, here's what to do." He turned his head and looked at Gideon. "You know what I mean." "I know." "She's going to be the thing people remember about this period," Russell said. "Not you, not me, her." He said it without any edge in it, just assessment. The woman who came with nothing and saw everything. Gideon thought about the train platform again. The cold morning, the crushed hat, the single tear that she hadn't known was there, running down her face while she looked for a man she'd never met in a place she'd never been. What he had seen then, what had stopped him from turning away, had not been beauty, exactly, though she was beautiful. It had been something underneath that. The way she caught herself on the steps and stood straight immediately. The way she met his eyes without looking for reassurance. The way she said 17 cents like it was a number, just a number, and looked at him to see what he'd do with it. He had done the only thing he could do with it, which was the best thing. "She came to survive," Gideon said. "She stayed because she decided to." "That's the truest thing about people," Russell said. "What they do when they decide." The light faded while they sat there, the mountains going from gold to rose to the deep blue of evening, and the valley settled into its autumn quiet, and neither man said anything more for a while because nothing more needed saying. Russell Kellerman died the following February, which was still winter and cold and hard in the way winters were, and the valley felt his absence in specific places. At cooperative meetings where his voice had always been the one that said plainly what everyone else was still deciding whether to say, and on the road north of town where you might look up and see him coming on his old brown gelding and know that the valley was proceeding as it should. His granddaughter Clara kept the ranch. She was capable and stubborn and had some of Russell's quality of saying difficult things without apologizing for them, and the cooperative welcomed her at the same seat her grandfather had kept. At the spring meeting that year, the first without Russell present, Isabella read the minutes of the previous meeting, as she always did, and at the end she set the ledger down and said, without announcement, that she wanted to note for the record that the cooperative had been built on the argument that no ranch stood alone and that Russell Kellerman had believed that before anyone else had the documents to prove it. She said it in 2 sentences, precise, without ornamentation, and went back to the ledger. Clara Kellerman, across the table, pressed her lips together and nodded once. That was all. That was the right amount. The train station in Cedar Ridge had a bench outside it, on the south side of the platform, where the morning sun hit first. Gideon sat on it sometimes. Not often, and not for long. He was not a man built for sitting without purpose, but occasionally, when he was in town and had a few minutes before something else, he sat there. He had sat on that bench the morning Isabella's train came in. He had stood from it when the train stopped and walked toward a woman he had already decided to turn around. He remembered the quality of the cold that morning, and the sound the train made settling against its brakes, and the way the steam came off the engine in the still air. He remembered her catching herself on the steps, standing straight, looking for him with those clear green eyes in a face that was doing its level best to be calm. He remembered thinking, I have to send her back. He remembered thinking it and meaning it. There was a version of himself, somewhere in some unconsidered life, who had done that, who had handed her train fare plus extra for her trouble and turned Fletcher north and ridden home to the silence that had settled into his bones like cold, and who was living there still in that silence, getting better and better at it, which was the worst kind of getting better at something. That man had missed everything. What you noticed, he had come to believe, was not random. It was connected to what you were willing to see. He could have looked at that platform and seen a stranger he owed nothing to, an arrangement he hadn't made, an inconvenience to be efficiently resolved. He had instead seen a tear on a cold morning and followed that tear to the truth of it, which was a person worth knowing. You never knew, in advance, which small thing you were willing to look at will turn out to be the one that changes everything. That was both the hardest part of being human and the most important part. You had to keep looking, even when you were tired, even when looking had cost you before. You had to keep turning toward things instead of away from them, because the things that mattered almost never announced themselves as the things that would matter. They arrived the way Isabella had arrived, quietly, in the early cold, with nothing obvious to recommend them except the willingness to stay. He had almost sent her back. He never stopped being grateful that he hadn't. The mountains were the same mountains they had always been. The valley was the valley it had always been, and different. The ranch that had been a hiding place was a home now in the full sense of that word, contested and imperfect and alive with the specific difficulty of two people building something together and choosing, each day, to keep building. Some mornings he came downstairs to find Isabella already at the table with coffee and papers and the focused look of someone who had been thinking since before the light came. Some mornings he came down first and had the coffee ready when she appeared, squinting and unsatisfied with how the pillow had treated her, and she sat across from him and they talked about what needed doing and sometimes about other things. And the kitchen was warm. The curtains she had fixed in the first 12 minutes of the first night were still hanging. The stitches were small and even and had held through 3 winters without loosening because she did not do things halfway. He had not deserved her when she stepped off that train. I was not sure he deserved her now, precisely, in any simple accounting. But he had done one right thing in one cold morning on a train platform, which was to look at a person who was holding herself together with everything she had and to not turn away. And she had done one right thing in return, which was to stay long enough for the rest of it to be possible. That was how most important things happened, he had come to believe. Not in grand gestures or clear choices or obvious moments of decision. In small things, looked at honestly. In a tear on a platform. In 17 cents named without shame. In 12 minutes and small even stitches. In coffee already made. In a woman on her knees in a recovered garden, turning to look at him across the dirt with the plain question of whether this was real and the plain willingness to find out. The valley held. The ranch held. And every morning the mountains were there, unchanged and enormous, watching over all of it with the impartiality of things that have seen many beginnings and do not distinguish between them, but hold them all equally in the long, patient light.